Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 75, Master and Servant. A short while later, the mystic sect cultivators under Chu Tian's leadership found a tunnel to rest and recuperate. Chu Tian leaned against the rock wall, waiting for the people from the sect to deliver the supplies while using his battlefield imprint to send out a message. Inside the base of Mystic Sect, several large buildings were scattered among the spirit peaks like the pieces on a chessboard. The spiritual qi lingered among the mountains and the base was enveloped in a dense fog. The situation inside could not be seen from the outside. It was clear that the base was protected by a grand array. In a courtyard located on one of the mountain peaks, the handsome and dashing Wang Yang dressed in white stood by the fish pond. He casually threw some fish food into the pond and watched the koi fish in the pond competing for it. Xiaozhu stood behind him quietly. All of a sudden, Xiaozhu activated her battlefield imprint and quickly checked something. She lifted her head and said, "Young master, Chu Tian encountered the mountain tiger. He invited the other party over for a visit but was rejected." Wang Yang said nothing. He finished feeding the fish and dusted off his hands. Walking over to a chair nearby, he took a seat and sipped on a cup of tea. Only then did he speak unhurriedly. "It's within my expectations. Somebody like that would not enter the base of another sect so easily." "Then why did you invite him over, young master?" She was puzzled. He chuckled. "Many of our junior brothers and junior sisters in the sect have received his saving grace. They even profited because of him. It's only natural that we should extend a sign of sincerity. It is our choice whether or not to invite him. Likewise, it is his choice whether or not to accept the invitation." She made a non-committal sound in response. What else did the message say? Chu Tian confirms that the mountain tiger does indeed have a powerful spirit artifact in his possession. Also, that person called himself Yi. He looked pensive for a moment, then he shook his head. The name was completely unfamiliar to him. Intriguing rising stars would pop up in the cultivation world of Jiuzhou from time to time. Few people would know of their existence before they debuted in the world. But their light would be dazzling indeed once they began to shine. Needless to say, many rising stars would be eliminated before they could begin to shine. The cultivation world was full of dangers, especially in this chaotic Spirit Creek battlefield where countless geniuses died every year. Chu Tian also claimed that this person seemed to have mastered a defensive spiritual pattern. That spiritual pattern could be used at will during battle, and was capable of defending against the attacks of a fourth-order Spirit Creek realm master. During the battle, Lu Yi had frequently activated the spiritual patterns in his arsenal. The sharp-edged spiritual pattern was less noticeable because it was endowed upon the long knife. Even if it was activated, an outsider would only assume that it was a prohibition that came with the long knife. They would not think too deeply about it. On the contrary, the protection spiritual pattern was not the same. Even if the spiritual pattern would vanish in an instant, there was no concealing it from Chu Tian's intentional observation. A defensive spiritual pattern that could be used at will during battle? He was actually a little shocked now. A third-order Spirit Creek realm master? It had to be said that spiritual patterns were extremely complicated and mysterious. Therefore, it required a long time to learn and research the spiritual patterns. He himself had tried his hand at learning spiritual patterns when he was bored in the past. However, the lines and patterns recorded in the books were incredibly complicated and confusing. Reading the books left him feeling drowsy every time. It also made his head buzz painfully. In the end, he tore the book to pieces with his own hands and gave up on it. That's what Chu Tian said. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. Which major sect did this freak come from? Wang Yang had reached the conclusion that Lu Yi was definitely a disciple from one of the top major sects who probably came to the outer circle for training due to a low cultivation base. The reason he formed such speculation was entirely due to Lu Ye's shocking performance recently. According to the data from Mystic Sect, just based on what they had seen in the past few days, no less than 29 Star Clan cultivators had lost their lives at Lu Ye's hands. Furthermore, many of them were fourth-order Spirit Creek realm masters. Being able to kill beyond one's cultivation was an indicator that a person came from a major sect. A small sect could not have produced such astounding disciples. Moreover, Lu Yi had a beast for a pet. That majestic beast was not something an ordinary person could subdue. Combined with the information that Chu Tian brought back today, Wang Yang was becoming more and more certain of his conjecture. Only a person who came from power could have such profound heritage and capability to activate a spiritual pattern in battle despite only being in the third-order Spirit Creek realm. The name Mountain Tiger was something Wang Yang himself came up with. That was because, in his opinion, Lu Yi was a fierce tiger climbing a mountain. This manner of letting a disciple out to roam in the wild is a bit like something that sect in Tianzhou would do. Not to mention that there are many top spiritual pattern masters there. He murmured thoughtfully. Xiao Zhu did not know which sect Wang Yang was referring to. All she knew was that the mountain tiger with the name Yi came from an unusual background. She asked, "Young master, should we help him in secret?" "There's no need for that." He waved his hand dismissively. "He came out for training, so his survival has nothing to do with us. Why should we help him? If we don't handle this matter well, we might end up hurting him instead." Many of the major sects had the habit of letting their disciples out to roam freely. These talented disciples would leave the protection of their sects, while their cultivation was still low, and travel the world on their own to hone their skills. Although this manner of doing things was very risky, these people would far exceed their peers once they successfully developed their strength. That was why there was an unwritten rule in the Spirit Creek battlefield. The major sects could not retaliate even if their disciples in training were killed. This was the price they had to pay for the sake of growth. In any case, the major sects were not short of talented individuals. They generally did not grieve the death of these geniuses, unless the dead disciple was a relative of a high-ranking individual in the sect. Nevertheless, that would only count as the private act of revenge of an individual. It had nothing to do with the sect. If Wang Yang could speculate that Lu Yi was a disciple from one of the major sects, then it was only natural that Nine Star Clan would also come to the same conclusion. Even so, the Nine Star Clan did not give up hunting Lu Yi down. It wasn't that the Nine Star Clan was not worried about the major sects. It was just that they knew the major sects would not trouble them over something as trivial as this. Besides, this war began because of that person. Mystic Sect has helped to draw enough pressure away from him. If he knew what was good for him, he should obediently come and grovel at my feet to thank me instead. He laughed lightly. She rolled her eyes at his words. As his personal maid, she knew much more than other people. The declaration of war might seem like Mystic Sect was simply taking advantage of the situation, but the truth was that it was premeditated. It was just that he had failed to find the right time to implement this plan. Lu Yi killing the young master of Nine Star Clan had simply given the opportunity for him to do so. Putting it that way, Lu Yi could be considered his lucky charm. He was about to leave for the inner circle of the battlefield. A 7th Order Spirit Creek Realm Master was nothing special there, so there was a high chance he might face extremely dangerous situations. That was why he wanted to deal a huge blow to the Nine Star Clan before he left. By doing so, even if something happened to him later, the situation here would be stable for a while until somebody could replace him. "How are the casualties?" Wang Yang asked. 30 have died, but 70% of them are rogue cultivators, Xiao Zhu replied. He nodded at those words. The results were quite satisfactory to him. He ordered, "Intensify the efforts and end this declaration of war as soon as possible." Ending this declaration of war as soon as possible is only the beginning of my plan. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 76. Gluttonous Feast. Similarly, Nine Star Clan was also calculating the number of casualties it suffered so far. Chao Yi looked at Dong Shuyi gloomily. "Senior brother, our casualties are too high. We've already lost close to 60 people since the start of the war." Dong Shuyi was shocked. Why are the numbers so high? Even if Nine Star Clan was no match for Mystic Sect, there was no reason for them to suffer such great losses in just a few days' time. Chao Yi replied, "It's all because of that mountain tiger. He will suddenly attack out of nowhere when both parties are engaged in battle. Many of our disciples have died because of him." "That damned bastard!" Dong Shuyi raged. His expression darkened for a moment. What about the 5th Order Spirit Creek Realm Masters in the sect? They are all being watched. Chao Yi was feeling rather exasperated. There were so few fifth-order Spirit Creek Realm Masters that both sects could deploy at the moment. Since they knew everything about each other, it was very easy for the other party to target their weaknesses. Senior brother, should I take action? Dong Shuyi shook his head. You can't. If you make a move, then Wang Yang won't just sit back and watch. Besides, can you handle that lowly wench? The lowly wench he was referring to was none other than Xiao Zhu. Xiao Yi replied with a troubled expression. I can't beat her. But she can't kill me either. That maid might come from a humble background, but her strength was undeniable. He did not know what kind of luck Wang Yang was born with for a maid serving by his side to grow to such a degree. What about Luoji? Dong Shuyi asked. Speaking of Luoji, Xiao Yi felt his headache intensifying. That guy did not take this declaration of war seriously at all. I have no idea where he went. He doesn't reply to any of the messages I sent either. He comes from Infinite Island. Of course, he does not take our declaration of war seriously. Dong Shuye's expression was stormy. After a while he gritted his teeth. Doesn't he want Zi? Tell him that as long as he brings me the head of that mountain tiger, I will give Zi to him. Senior brother. Xiao Yi glanced at Dong Shuyi in shock. Go! Dong Shuyi shouted. Yes. Xiao Yi accepted the order with a sullen expression. When he walked out of the hall, he turned and glanced at a young girl in purple clothes who was crouching in front of a flower bed and sniffing the fragrance of the flowers. Chu Tian soon received a message. At first, he thought that it was a reply from senior brother Wang Yang. However, a quick check told him that it was actually a message from someone he had never contacted before. Moreover, the message was very simple and contained only 2 words, Chu Tian. Chu Tian was completely mystified by the message. Nevertheless, he soon realized who it was that had sent him the message. There was only one person he had never contacted before in the records of his battlefield imprint. Thus he immediately replied to the message, Yes, it's me. Do you need something, junior brothery? No. He received an immediate reply from the other side. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. If there's nothing, then why did you send me a message? I thought that the mountain tiger had something important to tell me. After pondering for a moment, he sent another message. If there's something you need, junior brother Yi, please let me know. I will definitely help you if it is within my abilities. Like a rock sinking into the sea, his message received no response whatsoever. On the other side, Lu Yi hid in one of the tunnels and perceived his battlefield imprint with a strange expression. He was feeling a little odd. Does this count as my first friend in my contact list? I really do not understand how this world works. Ever since I entered the Spirit Creek battlefield, one strange thing after another has been happening without pause. Fortunately, his investigation indicated that communicating with Chu Tian would not reveal his real name. That made him feel slightly relieved. Ignoring Chu Tian's message, he took some spirit pills to restore his strength. The consumption during the previous battle was not high, so he recovered completely in less than half a day's time. Be that as it may, he did not stop there. He continued to consume spirit pills to try and break the barrier of one of his spiritual points instead. Even though he was only in the 3rd order Spirit Creek realm, he had already unlocked 28 spiritual points. The extra spiritual point was the spiritual point recorded in the Gluttonous Feast. He had cultivated the Golden Liberation technique to completion. Since he did not have any higher grade cultivation techniques in his possession, he had no way to further his cultivation. After mulling over this issue, he decided to cultivate the Gluttonous Feast. This cultivation technique was something he bought for 3 spirit stones. It included 15 spiritual points, and most of these points overlapped with the Golden Liberation technique. There were only 2 spiritual points in the Gluttonous Feast that were not included in the system of the Golden Liberation technique. There was nothing better to do anyway, so starting from a few days back, he began to wonder about the Gluttonous Feast. Now that he had successfully unlocked 1 spiritual point, he would be able to see the truth behind this cultivation technique once he unlocked 1 more spiritual point. According to the cultivator who sold this cultivation technique could double a person's cultivation efficiency. It was just that Lu Yi felt certain that he had been ripped off. There could not exist such a heaven-defying cultivation technique. Even if there was, it would not be sold so casually. Either way, the 2 extra spiritual points were real. If he unlocked 2 spiritual points now, then he could unlock 2 less spiritual points when cultivating a higher-grade cultivation technique in the future. In any case, he cultivated this cultivation technique with the mindset that he had nothing to lose. His spiritual power surged and repeatedly slammed into the barrier of his spiritual point. Compared to the time when he first started cultivating, it was much easier for him to break through the barriers of his spiritual points now. That was because he had accumulated enough spiritual power in his body. With every impact, the barrier of his spiritual point would weaken even more. A feeling of soreness also spread out from his spiritual point. Approximately 2 hours later, he abruptly felt the barrier around his spiritual point shattering. He had unlocked his 29th spiritual point. What came next was simple. In order to operate a set of cultivation techniques, he had to allow his spiritual power to flow according to the training course of the cultivation technique. Seeing as 15 of the spiritual points in the gluttonous feast overlapped with a large part of the golden liberation technique, he first had to stop the operation of the golden liberation technique to operate the gluttonous feast. There was no need to cut off the 3rd microcosmic orbit since those 9 spiritual points were not included in the training course of the gluttonous feast. He had never done anything like interrupting the operation of his spiritual power before. However, he discovered that it was actually a very simple task after experimenting for a bit. The microcosmic orbit circulation system was produced by the rapid flow of his spiritual power, passing through his 9 spiritual points. As long as he stabilized the rapidly flowing spiritual power, the flowing spiritual power would return to their respective spiritual points and become quiet again. He tried making his spiritual power flow once more. It only took a moment for it to return to its original state. Now that he had a plan in mind, he relaxed considerably and became much bolder as a result. He calmed the flowing spiritual power of the first 2 microcosmic orbit circulation systems in his body once more. When all his spiritual power had returned to his spiritual points, he began directing his spiritual power through the 15 spiritual points in sequence according to the training course of the gluttonous feast. The first circulation. The second circulation. Gradually, the speed of his spiritual power flow became faster and faster until it could operate independently without his urging. An idea came to him all of a sudden. He hurriedly took out a spirit pill and swallowed it. In the next moment, the squirming in his abdomen became more apparent. It felt as though his entire lower abdomen had turned into a millstone. The spirit pill that he swallowed quickly released its pill power and transformed into spiritual power under the grinding of the millstone. He jerked open his eyes with a shocked expression. He abruptly realized that the person named Chan, he who sold him this cultivation technique, had not been lying. The gluttonous feast could actually double a person's cultivation efficiency. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 77, Flights of Fancy. The pill power was released at a much faster rate than before. In this way, it was a given that the efficiency of refining spirit pills would be improved. Chan he had been speaking the truth. No wonder he dared to swear on the heavenly oath in front of me. However, Lu Yi quickly understood why this cultivation technique was being sold all over the place. The gluttonous feast was certainly capable of doubling a person's cultivation efficiency. Although it sounded extremely overpowered at first, the truth was that cultivators would accumulate pill poison when they cultivated through the use of spirit pills. Once the pill poison began to build up, the spiritual power in their bodies would become murky and obscure. The more spirit pills they refined, the more apparent this situation would become. Therefore, cultivators would stop taking spirit pills after cultivating for some time. They had to figure out a way to remove the pill poison from their bodies instead. In other words, under normal circumstances, it made no difference to a cultivator whether their efficiency of refining spirit pills was fast or slow. Rather, there were benefits to being slower. But Lu Yi was different. He had the skill tree which could burn away the pill poison. So a spirit pill would only be transformed into spiritual power. Moreover, his spiritual power was much purer than what most cultivators could achieve despite their best efforts. In this way, the gluttonous feast's effect of improving cultivation efficiency was the real deal to him. It could be said that the combination of the skill tree, and the gluttonous feast was simply a match made in heaven. Upon realizing this fact, he couldn't help feeling a little excited. With this, he would undoubtedly save a lot of time on cultivation in the future. This also meant that he was destined to go even further on the road of cultivating through the use of spirit pills. The pill power of one spirit pill was quickly exhausted. In return, his body gradually filled with spiritual power. It might be that he had just finished a cultivation session, but his stomach began to growl. He immediately took out some food from his storage bag and ate heartily. All of a sudden, he noticed something interesting. His ability to digest his food had also become much stronger. The 15 spiritual points of the gluttonous feast were all distributed around the stomach area. When the cultivation technique was in operation, his entire stomach would squirm violently as though it was a millstone. The mighty grinding force not only quickened the refinement of the pill power, but also the digestion of food. After a series of investigations, he discovered the principle behind how the gluttonous feast worked. It was not as simple as mere digestion. Rather, it was more about gathering. There was no point in digestion without absorption. Only through absorption could the cultivation efficiency truly be improved. From what he could perceive, he suddenly realized that he would get a pattern that seemed rather familiar to him if all 15 spiritual points were connected in a specific sequence. He briefly thought about it. Then he lifted a hand and activated his spiritual power to construct a spiritual pattern. It was the third spiritual pattern that he obtained, gathering spirits. An invisible pulling force was born the moment the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern appeared in his hand, causing all the surrounding spiritual chi to flow in this direction. The gathering spirit's spiritual pattern was an extremely complicated and intricate pattern that was constructed using spiritual power. On the other hand, the pattern he discovered when he connected all the spiritual points of the gluttonous feast in a specific sequence was undoubtedly much simpler. Nevertheless, they were probably derived from the same source. Is it a coincidence? Or did the cultivator who created the gluttonous feast cultivation technique copy the structure of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern? The main purpose of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern was to gather the world's spiritual chi. If he replaced the spiritual chi with pill power, then the gluttonous feast was certainly also gathering. It was just that the gluttonous feast was transforming all the pill power it gathered into spiritual power for a cultivator to absorb. If I think about it in that way, a vague idea suddenly popped into his head. However, he discovered that he could not conceptualize his idea when he tried to focus on it. Thus, he lost himself in his thoughts while leaving the gluttonous feast to operate on its own. The world's spiritual chi in his surroundings was pulled toward him by a mysterious guiding force. Then it would sink into the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern on his hand before dispersing back into the air. The process repeated itself over and over again. However, he soon came to notice that a part of the world's spiritual chi had entered his abdomen. Under the grinding of the gluttonous feast, the world's spiritual chi was being turned into his own spiritual power. This phenomenon astonished him greatly. He had always used the method of refining spirit pills to cultivate, and supplemented that practice by refining his vitality into chi. The main reason was that his cultivation efficiency of absorbing the world's spiritual chi was extremely low. His body had a hard time accepting the spiritual chi. It was as though there was an invisible barrier covering his body that kept the world's spiritual chi isolated outside his body. Even cultivating with the aid of spirit stones was not very efficient. Strictly speaking, a spirit stone was the condensation of spiritual chi. Since it was difficult for his body to accept spiritual chi, it was only natural that he could not accept the power of the spirit stones either. Be that as it may, the gluttonous feast was gathering spiritual energy to grind and refine even though he was not cultivating at the moment. This scenario successfully verified his previous conjecture. The person who created the gluttonous feast cultivation technique must have copied the structure of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern. Otherwise, these two would not have such similar properties. Needless to say, the spiritual chi gathered by the gluttonous feast was not much. This cultivation technique's real purpose was to refine everything that was consumed. Gathering spiritual chi was simply a side effect. As he mulled over this, the vague and indistinct idea from before suddenly became clear. The gluttonous feast can gather spiritual chi. Likewise, the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern can gather spiritual chi. The two of them originate from the same source. The effects of the gluttonous feast cultivation technique come from the operation of the 15 spiritual points connected in a specific sequence, so the focus was on the spiritual points. In that case, what if I endow a spiritual point with the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern? What will happen then? Lu Yi was shocked by his bold idea. He was just an unimportant cultivator who only started cultivating several months ago, so he was utterly clueless about common sense in the cultivation world. Nevertheless, even he knew how important a spiritual point was to a cultivator. It could be said that the entire life of a cultivator would be affected if a problem arose with one of the spiritual points. When he first obtained the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern, he had studied the characteristics of this spiritual pattern and finally came to the conclusion that it was trash. That was because his body had a hard time accepting spiritual chi from the outside, so activating the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern would do nothing for him. Unexpectedly, he seemed to have found a blind spot in his analysis. His hand was not the only place he could cast the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern. He could also cast this spiritual pattern on other places. For example, his spiritual point. If I can pull off this idea of mine, then gathering spirits is definitely not rubbish. It might even turn out to be the most useful spiritual pattern of all. The more he considered the idea, the more he believed that it was feasible. Thus, he stopped the operation of the gluttonous feast cultivation technique and switched over to the golden liberation technique instead. Other cultivators would never dare to cast a spiritual pattern on their spiritual point. The main reason was that the construction of a spiritual pattern was extremely complicated. Even the most experienced of spiritual pattern masters could fail in the construction of a spiritual pattern. If the construction of a spiritual pattern failed, the spiritual power used in the construction of the spiritual pattern would explode and cause damage to the spiritual point. However, Lu Yi did not have any concerns in this regard. He currently mastered 3 spiritual patterns. Every time he obtained a new spiritual pattern, a large amount of information regarding the spiritual pattern would be forcibly poured into his head. Therefore, there was no precedent of him failing to construct a spiritual pattern before. Even if that was the case, he did not dare to try anything on his source spiritual point and chose a different spiritual point instead. The source spiritual point was the most important spiritual point of them all. If something went wrong with it, then it really was over for him. On the other hand, he might still have a way to remedy the situation if something happened to the other spiritual points. Perceiving the location of the spiritual point, he moved his mind gently and activated his spiritual power to bless his spiritual point with the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern. Contrary to his expectations, the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern was dissipated by the spiritual power flowing through his body in an instant. No, it needs some adjustment. I cannot cast the spiritual pattern inside my spiritual point or there will be no way to maintain it. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 78. A Small Funnel. Despite numerous attempts and countless failures, Lu Yi did not become discouraged. Instead, he became more and more excited. That was because he was accumulating experience with every failure he faced. The hardest part about casting the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern on a spiritual point was the surging of his spiritual power. The spiritual power flowing through the circulation would wash the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern away. Therefore, he needed to avoid the flood of his spiritual power if he wanted to cast the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern on a spiritual point. There was no chance of success otherwise. Unfortunately, this would create another problem. If the constructed spiritual pattern was located too far away from the spiritual point, then it would not have much of an effect. For example, if he constructed the spiritual pattern on his hand, the spiritual pattern would function to gather the spiritual chi. It was just that his body had difficulty in accepting spiritual chi from an external source, so he had no way of converting the spiritual chi into his own spiritual power. It was necessary that he found the balancing point which would allow the spiritual pattern to function perfectly, while also maintaining the balance of the spiritual pattern. Fortunately, the consumption of constructing the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern was not high. That was something he already discovered when he first obtained the spiritual pattern. He was still unsuccessful 4 hours later. Therefore, he decided to try changing the shape of the spiritual pattern. Under normal circumstances, a spiritual pattern would be displayed as a flat surface when constructed. It was impossible for a person to make changes to a spiritual pattern unless that person had extremely profound attainments in this field. Although Lu Yi did not have the knowledge that came from researching spiritual patterns, a huge amount of information regarding the respective spiritual patterns had flooded his mind when he obtained these spiritual patterns. That knowledge had given him great insight into the mysteries of these spiritual patterns. When it came to the 3 spiritual patterns that he had mastered, he was perfectly capable of changing their forms. All he lacked was the practical experience of actually doing it. After another round of numerous attempts, he finally formed a gathering spirit spiritual pattern approximately half a day later. This time around, this spiritual pattern was no longer dissipated by the flow of his spiritual power. I did it! He looked ecstatic. Silently perceiving the state of his body, he could sense that the surrounding world spiritual chi was pouring into that spiritual point and being converted into his spiritual power under the influence of the spiritual pattern. At this moment, the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern had been transformed into the shape of a funnel. When he cast this spiritual pattern on his spiritual point, the tip of the funnel would poke into his spiritual point on the smallest margin possible. In other words, the spiritual chi gathered from the outside world would be injected into his spiritual point through this tiny funnel and directly converted through the flow of his spiritual power. There was no need for the spiritual chi to pass through his body. In this way, it didn't matter whether his talent in cultivation was 1 leaf or 64 leaves, it would not affect the effect of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern. I'm such a genius! He couldn't resist praising himself in his heat. Although he succeeded in casting the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern on his spiritual point, and also allowed his body to begin absorbing the world's spiritual chi, the effects of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern were very small and limited due to the small size of the spiritual pattern. Nevertheless, it was only 1 spiritual point. Now that I have unlocked 29 spiritual points, what would happen if I blessed all 29 spiritual points with the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern? He couldn't help looking forward to the results. If his idea could be implemented, then his cultivation would not be limited to only consuming spirit pills in the future. He would also be able to absorb the world's spiritual chi. Not only would it save a lot on cultivation resources, but it would also improve his cultivation efficiency at the same time. As soon as this idea appeared in his head, he could not suppress his excitement and immediately began experimenting. The second time was much easier after his first successful attempt previously. It didn't take him longer than an hour before he managed to cast a small funnel-like spiritual pattern on his second spiritual point, then his third spiritual point, followed by his fourth spiritual point. He was gradually getting better with practice. He began to notice a faint effect when he reached his 10th spiritual point. The effect became much more noticeable when he reached his 20th spiritual point. By the time he finished casting the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern on all 29 of his spiritual points, it was already night. At this point, he could distinctly feel that the world's spiritual chi in the surroundings was continuously pouring into his spiritual points. It was then converted into his strength with the rapid flow of his spiritual power. The gathering spirit's spiritual pattern could be maintained for a long time, since it was constantly gathering the world's spiritual chi to replenish itself. In principle, the gathering spirit's spiritual patterns in his body would last forever as long as he himself did not take the initiative to disperse them. Needless to say, this was impossible to actually achieve in reality. The spiritual patterns could only be maintained since his condition was stable at the moment. On the contrary, the flow of his spiritual power would surge violently the moment he started fighting, and that would easily destroy the spiritual patterns. In the end, this was a deal with relatively no cost. Lu Yi would only need to reconstruct the gathering spirit's spiritual patterns on his spiritual points at a suitable time. After that, the world's spiritual chi would gather and pour into his body without him doing anything whatsoever. He could even focus on doing other tasks. All that was left was to see how much these spiritual patterns would benefit him in a certain period of time. Thus, he quietly focused himself and sensed the changes in the spiritual power within his body in order to figure out the answer to this question. 6 hours later, he finally came to a conclusion. If he maintained the spiritual patterns on all of his 29 spiritual points for a day and a night, then the benefits he obtained were almost equivalent to consuming a spirit-restoring pill. It was not a lot but not little either. It had to be said that this was only the effects coming from 29 spiritual points. There were as many as a total of 360 spiritual points in a cultivator's body. If he could endow all 360 spiritual points with the gathering spirits one day, then the benefits he would gain would be monumental. He currently had a lot of spirit restoring pills in his possession. Not to mention that he also had the auxiliary cultivation technique Gluttonous Feast, as well as the support of the gathering spirit's spiritual pattern. He was feeling extremely eager and couldn't wait to find a place to retreat and cultivate until he reached the 9th Order Spirit Creek realm. Unfortunately, what made him feel extremely helpless was that he did not have a suitable cultivation technique on hand. The Golden Liberation technique that he previously received from Manager Yang could only be used up to the 3rd Order Spirit Creek realm. He originally planned to wait until he arrived at the next city and see if he could buy a cultivation technique from the Divine Trade Association. For this reason, he had sold 4 pieces of yuan metal during his journey and saved more than 200 spirit stones. Who could have expected that he would temporarily be unable to escape from the Split Sky Gorge? This is a bit troubling. After pondering over it for a while, Lu Yi lifted his hand, touched his battlefield imprint, and sent out a message. Chu Tian was meditating and recovering his strength when a message arrived suddenly. He hurriedly checked the message and saw that it was from Lu Yi. Having learned from his lesson during the day, he cautiously replied with a single sentence. Junior brother Yi, can I help you? Do you have any black-grade cultivation techniques? Sell me one. Chu Tian was very puzzled. Why do you need a black-grade cultivation technique? Inside the tunnel, Lu Yi stared at Chu Tian's message with a speechless expression. Is this guy an idiot? Even so, he patiently replied, to cultivate. Chu Tian couldn't help scratching his head in bewilderment when he saw Lu Ye's reply. A short while later, a message was sent to Mystic Sect's base. Wang Yang glanced at Xiao Zhu in surprise. Is the information true? Xiao Zhu nodded. It's a message from Chu Tian. It should be true. He seriously considered the matter for a moment and couldn't help snorting with laughter. That truly is the style of those major sects. The disciples who are sent out for training have to rely on themselves completely, so they don't even receive any cultivation techniques. It looks like he was previously cultivating a yellow-grade cultivation technique. Now that he has completed the 3rd Order Spirit Creek realm, he needs to switch to a new cultivation technique. Chu Tian is waiting for a reply. How should I answer? It's just a set of cultivation techniques that can be found anywhere. Just give it to him. Also, ask Chu Tian to ask him about his element. Okay. She nodded in response. These disciples from the major sects seem to be quite pitiful. Our sect might only be in the 9th tier, but our senior brothers and senior sisters will help us during the early stages of our cultivation. We don't have to suffer through so many hardships. By the way, don't just give it to him. The major sects hate that the most. Sell it to him, but don't charge him too many spirit stones. He is probably very poor. I got it. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 79. Luoji of Infinite Island. Inside the tunnel, the very poor Lu Yi was currently taking inventory of all his assets. He only had slightly over 200 spirit stones. He did not know if that was enough for him to purchase a set of cultivation techniques. If that's not enough, he took out the small bell spirit artifact from his storage bag. That was something the young master of 9-Star Clan used to own, so it was probably worth quite a lot. In the worst case, he could use this to offset his debt. If that did not work, then he could always use his yuan metal ore. He still had the storage bag that belonged to the young master of 9-Star Clan. There should be a lot of good things inside. It was a pity that he could not open it. Having said that, many Mystic Sect cultivators benefited from my actions over the past few days. It's only reasonable that Mystic Sect should give me a small discount, right? Chu Tian sent another message to ask about Lu Ye's element. Lu Yi answered honestly. There was no need to conceal this. Besides, it was very important for a set of cultivation techniques to match well with his element. A short while later, Chu Tian sent another message to inform Lu Yi that he would provide the exact details tomorrow at the earliest, and the day after tomorrow at the latest, since it would take some time for the cultivation technique to be delivered from the base. Lu Yi responded that it was no problem. After that, He ended the correspondence with Chu Tian and got up to get ready for sword practice. Even though he had been fighting continuously these days, he never stopped his sword practice. That was because he could tell that this most basic training had been of great help to him, and the success of something like that depended on perseverance. However, before he could draw his knife out of its sheath, the roar of a tiger rang out all of a sudden. He immediately turned to look behind him and saw Amber's figure rushing toward him in a miserable state. Yi, who had been monitoring the other side of the tunnel, came running over too. She glanced at him before hiding inside the rock wall. Meanwhile, Amber ran over to Lu Yi, turned around and lowered its body. There was a wound that could not be considered too serious on its body. It faced forward and let out a mighty roar. A figure slowly appeared from there. Lu Yi activated his spiritual power to check on the other party's aura, while making a decision in his heart. If the opponent is a 5th Order Spirit Creek Realm Master, we'll withdraw immediately. If the opponent is any lower than a 5th Order Spirit Creek Realm Master, then I'll slaughter him with no mercy. He frowned slightly when he saw the aura surrounding that person. Judging by the luster of the aura, that person was no more than a cultivator in the 2nd Order Spirit Creek realm. What puzzled him was that the aura around that person was very different from an ordinary 2nd Order Spirit Creek realm master. Not only was it extremely pure, but it also gave off a very solid feeling. It sure wasn't easy to find you. That person stood 30 meters away from Lu Yi and smiled. In the darkness of the night, his pearly white teeth stood out conspicuously. That person was not very old. He might even be younger than Lu Yi by a year or two. In addition, he did not have a burly stature. Even so, he made all the nerves in Lu Yi's body tense in apprehension just by standing there calmly. Lu Yi had fought many battles against the cultivators of 9-Star Clan over the past few days. He might not be able to accurately judge whether his opponent posed a threat to him, but he would get a vague sense of danger. This 2nd Order Spirit Creek Realm Master must have some sort of unique characteristic for him to make me feel so stressed. Mountain Tiger? That person spoke first. Without waiting for Lu Yi to respond, he went on to introduce himself. Luoji of Infinite Island. Lu Yi immediately recalled that Chu Tian had mentioned this person to him during the day. He did not question where Infinite Island was at the time, but judging from Chu Tian's manner of speech, it was probably a very powerful force. A cultivator who came from such a background was bound to have an extraordinary heritage. That was why he immediately leaped forward the moment the other party finished the introduction. The long knife came out of its sheath and he ran toward the man. Kill first, think later. He had managed to kill a 4th Order Spirit Creek Realm Master when he was only in the 2nd Order Spirit Creek Realm Master. Now that he was in the 3rd Order Spirit Creek Realm, why would he be afraid of somebody in the 2nd Order Spirit Creek Realm? His legs that were pumping with spiritual power rushed forward at a rapid speed, shortening the distance of 30 meters in an instant. His spiritual points made a crackling sound as the gathering spirit's spiritual patterns he previously constructed were all shattered under the violent surging of his spiritual power. Reckless man. Luoji snorted lightly. He raised his hand unhurriedly and pointed at Lu Yi. White flare. When those words left his mouth, a small fluorescent light appeared on his finger. That fluorescent light suddenly expanded and transformed into a glaring white light that fully illuminated the dark tunnel. Lu Yi was instantly blinded by that glaring light and could not open his eyes as a result. At this moment he felt as though he was staring straight at the sun. Even though he had closed his eyes as soon as possible, it was inevitable that he hurt his eyes. The pain made his tears flow unchecked. This damned bastard by the name of Luoji Shore is despicable. He hurriedly backed away. Earth protrusion. Luoji shouted again while simultaneously stomping his foot against the ground. In the next moment, a cone of soil formed on the ground behind Lu Yi without warning and slammed into his waist hard. He was in the midst of backing away when he was struck by the cone of soil, which caused him to stagger unsteadily as a result. His lumbar spine was aching badly. If he had not activated his spiritual power defense, he could have gotten seriously hurt. Icicle. Cold air swirled and Luoji pointed at Luo Yi. A sharp icicle about the length of a chopstick immediately shot toward Lu Yi like an arrow that was released from a bow. Lu Yi had yet to open his eyes. The main reason was that he had been stunned by the bright light that caught him off guard just now. When he felt the cold air coming straight at him, he immediately activated the protection spiritual pattern in front of him without even thinking about it. There was a loud bang. It was as though what slammed into the protection spiritual pattern was not an icicle but a huge rock instead. He was pushed back by the great force and staggered backward again. At the same time, he felt a searing pain across his cheeks. The shattered splinters of the icicle had resulted in numerous small wounds all over his face. Golden arc. Inside the tunnel, a golden crescent-like slash appeared. The attack slashed toward him as he backed away. Compared to all the other spell techniques from before, this spell technique carried much more lethality to it. Lu Yi once activated a golden will talisman paper. That was something that was created based on the golden arc as the foundation. The attacks that came flying out of the golden will talisman paper were numerous weakened golden arc slashes. Just in terms of power alone, the golden arc slash that Luoji released was even more powerful than the slashes of the golden will talisman paper that Lu Yi had once used. If a person was caught off guard and received a hit from this attack, that person might end up sliced into two halves. The golden arc slash was extremely fast, appearing in front of Lu Yi in the blink of an eye. The corners of Luoji's mouth curled upward. With a loud clang, the golden arc slash was cut down by Lu Yi. Behind the long knife, Lu Ye's eyes were narrowed into slits and his expression was extremely solemn. His opponent was only in the second-order Spirit Creek realm. Hence, he originally assumed that he could defeat Luoji even if there was something strange about the other party. It wasn't until he exchanged blows with his opponent that he realized how mistaken he was. This second-order Spirit Creek Realm Master was different from all the second-order Spirit Creek Realm Masters he had ever met. Over the course of the last few days, he had killed many 9-star clan disciples. He also witnessed how the mystic sect disciples fought. Although there was the occasional spell technique, those spell techniques had required a lot of time to prepare. None of those cultivators could do what Luoji was doing. On the other hand, Luoji's spell technique seemed to be right at his fingertips and could be called upon in an instant. Moreover, he had extremely high attainments in those techniques. It was obvious that he was walking the path of a spell cultivator. What surprised Lu Yi even more was that the spiritual power of this second-order Spirit Creek Realm Master seemed to be even richer than his own. He failed to tell from looking at his opponent's aura just now. But now that they were fighting, he could see the fluctuations in the other party's spiritual power with just a single glance. That was by no means the spiritual power fluctuation that a second-order Spirit Creek Realm Master could have. It was even stronger than the fourth-order Spirit Creek Realm Master he killed previously. Combining all the facts in front of him, he immediately thought of a possibility. This guy is cultivating a heaven-grade cultivation technique. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 80. Different cultivation techniques could be divided into 4 grades: Heaven Grade, Earth Grade, Black Grade, and Yellow Grade. A Yellow Grade cultivation technique would only allow a person to cultivate until the third-order Spirit Creek realm. On the other hand, a Black Grade cultivation technique could go up to the 6th-order Spirit Creek realm, while the Earth Grade could go up to the 9th-order Spirit Creek realm. There were only 9 orders in the Spirit Creek realm, so Earth Grade cultivation techniques were generally enough for a Spirit Creek realm master to complete their cultivation in the Spirit Creek realm. However, that was not always the case. An Earth Grade cultivation technique would only allow a cultivator to unlock 180 spiritual points, but a person's body contained a total of 360 spiritual points. Once all 180 spiritual points were unlocked, a cultivator would need to switch to the Heaven Grade cultivation technique in order to unlock even more spiritual points. A person who cultivated an Earth Grade cultivation technique and unlocked all 180 spiritual points would be in the 9th-order Spirit Creek realm. After switching to a Heaven Grade cultivation technique, that person would be able to unlock their 181st spiritual point. However, switching cultivation techniques would cause their original cultivation realm to drop by several orders. That was because 180 spiritual points were only equivalent to the 6th-order Spirit Creek realm according to the division of a Heaven Grade cultivation technique. In short, how many spiritual points a cultivator unlocked was not the criterion for determining a person's cultivation. The real criterion was how many microcosmic orbit circulations there were in a person's body. Therefore, a cultivator with the same number of spiritual points might not necessarily have the same cultivation. The sect master once explained the differences between the cultivation techniques to him during their one and only lesson together, so he remembered these things. Luoji might seem like just a second-order Spirit Creek Realm master. But the truth was that he had unlocked at least 50 or more spiritual points. That was because the fluctuations of his spiritual power were much stronger when he was casting spells compared to Lu Yi. Besides, cultivating a heaven-grade cultivation technique meant that a first-order Spirit Creek Realm Master would have 18 spiritual points, while a second-order Spirit Creek Realm Master would have 45 spiritual points. After realizing this point, Lu Yi immediately understood one thing. Luoji was the most powerful opponent he had ever met up until now. It had to be said that for all cultivation techniques that were Earth grade and below, having 45 spiritual points would put a person in the fourth-order Spirit Creek realm. In other words, the actual cultivation of Luoji, who was only in the second-order Spirit Creek realm because he cultivated a heaven-grade cultivation technique, was equivalent to an ordinary cultivator in the fourth-order Spirit Creek realm or the fifth-order Spirit Creek realm. Combined with his attainments in spell techniques, he would not lose to an ordinary fifth-order Spirit Creek realm master. This was the true heritage of a disciple from a top major sect. They would begin to determine their future path from a very young age. Then they would continue to study and explore their path to hone their bodies in their struggle to survive. Once they reached the suitable age to begin cultivating, they would not be in a hurry to improve their cultivation. That was because the number of spiritual points that they needed to unlock were 2 or 3 times more than that of ordinary cultivators. People like these would often be able to fight and overcome enemies who were 2 or 3 minor realms stronger than them even though their cultivation was still low. Even once their cultivation base improved, killing stronger enemies beyond their cultivation would be a common occurrence. People like these would become supreme powerhouses once they fully developed their skills. Lu Yi had the privilege of meeting a future supreme cultivator. The confrontation that lasted for only a moment ended in his complete defeat. He had rushed forward the moment Luoji appeared. However, his opponent's consecutive spell techniques had forced him back to his starting position again. The kingly way for a combat cultivator like him to confront a spell cultivator was to shorten the distance between them, but it was clear that it would not be easy to approach Luoji so easily. "Which sect are you from, you reckless man?" Luoji did not pursue victory just because he had the chance to win. It was not that he was underestimating Lu Yi. It was just that the current environment was simply not suited for a combat cultivator like Lu Yi to flourish. On the contrary, the environment would allow his spell techniques to become a greater threat. The ability to use spell techniques was extremely advantageous in the early stage of cultivation, especially seeing as the tunnel was too narrow for Lu Yi to maneuver about freely. It was obvious that Lu Yi had also noticed this. Although retreating through the rear exit was the correct thing to do at the moment, he had no intention of doing so. That was because he had the vague feeling that if he retreated now, he would never have the courage to face Luoji directly when they encountered each other again in the future. Besides, it could be inferred from what this person first said at the beginning that this person came here specifically to find him. There is no avoiding this. In that case, my only option is to fight. So what if the other party has a great heritage? Don't I have one too? When it comes down to it, all Luoji can cast are some small-scale spell techniques. The protection spiritual pattern can stop those attacks. Lu Yi tightened his grip on the knife he was holding in his right hand and leaned forward slightly. He shifted so that his center of gravity was lowered, and assumed the posture of a cheetah that was about to pounce. Taking a deep breath, the spiritual power in all 3 of his microcosmic orbit circulation systems began to churn violently. He suddenly rushed forward in the next moment, causing the gravel under his feet to fly. "White flare!" Luoji shouted. Lu Ye's eyes were still aching from when he suffered because of this attack previously. Therefore, he immediately squinted and simultaneously raised his left hand to block his eyes when he heard Luoji's shout. However, there was no strong burst of light. A frosty icicle came shooting at him instead. At the same time, he heard Luoji's mocking laughter. "I lied. Damned bastard!" He raged, finally understanding why his opponent would shout the name of the spell technique before casting the spell technique. It was all in preparation for this moment. Truly an insidious man. Raising his knife and slashing out, he shattered the icicle. Immediately following behind the first icicle was a rain of icicles. The sound of things flying through the air rang out endlessly. The other party seemed capable of releasing multiple spells in quick succession with no need for rest. If he had not seen this for himself, he would have suspected the other party of sneakily activating an ice-type spirit talisman paper. A series of clanging noises rang out. The knife in Lu Ye's hand danced as he smashed down the icicles coming at him. He had no choice but to use the protection spiritual pattern to block those icicles that he failed to cut down in time. It was very difficult for him to progress forward. The tunnel started to become cold from the large amount of ice chips that were scattered everywhere. A whole 10 seconds passed. During that time he only managed to move 3 steps forward. The icicles that came flying at him carried a huge impact that greatly hindered his progress as a result. Yi's small head suddenly popped out of the rock wall behind Luoji. However, Luoji immediately turned around to look at her before she could even make a move. It was as though he had eyes at the back of his head. He concurrently lifted a hand to point at her, and a golden arc slash flew out at her. She let out a scream and quickly retracted her head. Roar! Amber roared. It seemed to think that Yi had been injured. This tiger roar was clearly a little different from the usual. When the tiger roar reverberated through the tunnel, Lu Yi felt as though his head was smashed by a small hammer. Opposite him, Luoji staggered slightly and muttered in surprise. A spirit beast. Luoji had seen Amber before but did not bother to pay attention to the tiger. It wasn't until this moment that he realized the majestic white tiger had some special abilities. Unfortunately, he had no time for idle thoughts. Lu Yi had taken the opportunity to charge at him when he was distracted by the tiger roar just now. He shouted, "White flare!" After falling for this trick just now, how could Lu Yi fall for the same trick twice? He simply squinted slightly and continued charging forward regardless. Asterisk crack. 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 Asterisk the shattered ice chips that were scattered everywhere suddenly wrapped around Lu Ye's surroundings and quickly hardened in place. It seemed like Luoji was planning to freeze Lu Yi inside that block of ice. At a critical juncture, Lu Yi was forced to step back. Only then did he manage to stabilize himself again. There was a huge block of ice standing between him and Luoji. If he had not moved aside so quickly, that ice block would definitely have enveloped him. With Luoji's strength, he would have been doomed in that situation. Phew! Luoji let out a sigh of relief when he saw that Lu Yi was stopped by the ice block. The intensity of this battle had exceeded his expectations. He originally thought that it would be a piece of cake when 9-Star Sect first asked him to get rid of Lu Yi. Even if the other party came from one of the top powerhouses, his strength was not just for show. A third-order Spirit Creek Realm Master who cultivated an ordinary cultivation technique was not worth his attention. It wasn't until he actually fought Lu Yi that he realized something. Unlike all the other third-order Spirit Creek Realm Masters he met before, this third-order Spirit Creek Realm Master was a little different. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 81, Intense Battle. Given Luoji's power, he could easily kill those third-order cultivators with just 2 to 3 moves. However, he had used many moves on Lu Yi, but he still hadn't managed to kill him. He was especially surprised that this mountain tiger was able to use a spiritual pattern in a battle. Studying spiritual patterns was much harder than spell techniques, because building spiritual patterns was delicate work. Any slight mistake would lead to failure, not to mention activating them in a battle. Normally, only experienced spiritual pattern masters were able to do that. However, Lu Yi was just a young man, but he was already adept at using one. Through his observation, Luoji could confirm that Lu Yi had mastered a defensive spiritual pattern, which could fend off his icicle technique. Furthermore, Lu Yi was able to use it as he pleased. That revelation made him stop looking down on Lu Yi. Before leaving his sect, his senior brothers had warned him not to be complacent and underestimate any enemy. Although Lu Yi hadn't opened up as many spiritual points or learned as many techniques as he had, his spiritual pattern technique was rarely mastered by any cultivators. With that said, Luoji didn't back down because of that. Instead, his fighting spirit had been ignited. The people he had come across since he left the sect were all much weaker than he was. Now that he had finally bumped into an equal match, he certainly wouldn't miss this chance. While he was in his thoughts, a cold glint from a blade flashed across his eyes. Following a crack, a gap appeared in the middle of the huge ice block. Through the gap, a figure was coming right at him like a gust of wind. How did he break my ice jail technique so easily? Luoji was shocked, as it wasn't an ordinary ice block. Instead, it was a spell technique that was built on the foundation of the icicle technique. Although it couldn't confine Lu Yi, it shouldn't be broken so easily. That also made him realize that the sword in Lu Ye's hands was no ordinary weapon. Certainly, he wasn't able to ward off the attack. In the light of that, he activated his spiritual power and threw several moves at him. Lu Yi charged forward at full speed. This time he didn't break the attacks with his sword, nor did he dodge them. Instead, he forcefully pushed him way through the attacks, as the enemy's technique was warded off by his spiritual pattern. Inside the dark tunnel, lights repeatedly expanded as the gap between them shortened. Luoji's eyelids twitched as he secretly cursed at Lu Yi for being reckless. However, without a doubt, he was starting to become terrified of this reckless guy. In a battle between a combat cultivator and a spell cultivator, the latter would gain the upper hand when there was a long distance between them. However, once they got closer, the spell cultivator would usually end up in a miserable state. In just 3 breaths' time, Lu Yi reached a spot that was only 6 meters away from Luoji. A cold glint flashed across the blade in his hand. As he inched closer, he wielded his sword at him. Hurriedly, Luoji dashed backwards, but just then, Yi appeared behind him once again as she swiftly raised her hand and landed a palm on his shoulder. Upon that realization, Luoji was horrified, but he soon noticed that this strike wasn't harmful at all. His spiritual power, which was protecting his body, could easily fend it off. All of a sudden, a spiritual light expanded behind him. The spiritual light was so sharp that it was as though countless needles had been jabbed into his back. Upon landing a palm on his shoulder, he exclaimed in pain and went away. After getting blocked by her earlier, Luoji was unable to flee anymore. If Lu Yi were any other third-order cultivator, Luoji was confident of warding off the attack with his spiritual power. However, he had seen how ruthless Lu Yi was when breaking the ice jail technique, so he wouldn't dare to underestimate the power of this strike. He activated his spiritual power and yelled, "Mist Shield!" Following that, he was surrounded by a layer of mist in an instant. Lu Yi slashed at the mist, but he was unable to break the mist shield. He felt as though he had hacked his sword into a piece of rubber, and his weapon got stuck inside it. As Luoji stepped backwards, he pointed at Lu Yi and said through clenched teeth, "Golden Arc." This time it was Lu Yi who was unable to dodge. The golden arc struck right at his chest, but before that, he had activated a spiritual pattern to protect himself. Following that, he lifted his sword again and hacked at the mist. Icicle, Wind Blade, Thunder Halberd. Inside the tunnel, Luoji's barks reverberated around the place. Following his shouts, he activated spell techniques of different attributes and struck right at Lu Ye's chest with loud booms. Although he appeared imposing, he was actually stepping backwards. That was because as Lu Yi repeatedly slashed at the mist shield, it started showing signs of falling apart. "I don't believe you can keep using the spiritual pattern," Luoji bellowed as he traded moves with Lu Yi. Even though he was astounded to see that Lu Yi was able to use a spiritual pattern in a battle, he knew that it was energy-consuming to sustain one. As soon as Lu Yi exhausted his spiritual power, he would stand a chance to defeat him. However, the reckless guy in front of him remained silent, like he was a mute, as he became increasingly ruthless with his strikes. A moment later, Luoji's eyelids twitched as he realized that the situation wasn't in his favor. While it was exhausting for Lu Yi to use a spiritual pattern, Luoji had to consume a lot of spiritual power to use his spell techniques as well. Although he had more spiritual power than Lu Yi, he had used too many spells. Furthermore, in order to prevent Yi from launching a sneak attack on him, he had to sustain the mist shield, which exacerbated his consumption of energy. If this intense battle dragged on, it was hard to tell who would be the last one standing. Upon coming up with an idea, he yelled, "White Flare." When he raised his hand, there was already a talisman paper between his fingers, whereupon he infused his spiritual power into it. Lu Yi had a feeling that he wasn't able to keep going. It had only been a few minutes since the battle started, but in such a short period of time, 80% of his spiritual power had been used. This was the most intense battle he had come across so far. But his enemy was only a second-order cultivator. Therefore, when Luoji shouted white flare, he immediately realized something was off and dashed backwards. At the same time, he snuck his hand into the storage bag on his waist and pinched a talisman paper between his fingers. As their eyes met, they became startled for a moment. Following the activation of their spiritual powers, 2 talisman papers shone brightly at the same time. Then 3 water columns shot towards Lu Yi. On the other hand, a fire snake zigzagged towards Luoji. With a loud boom, the tunnel shook violently as rocks started falling down. The clash between water and fire caused the tunnel to be filled with vapor. The spiritual lights of Lu Yi and Luoji glinted as they were sent flying away upon impact. Both of them secretly cursed at each other as they got to their feet with difficulty. When Lu Yi raced after Luoji with the sword in his hand, Luoji had already fled from the tunnel as he turned around and cast a talisman paper at Lu Yi. Hurriedly, Lu Yi ducked his head as the talisman paper exploded into countless golden lights and formed holes on the ground. Lifting his head, he realized that Luoji was running away, which prompted him to race after his enemy at full speed. Seeing as Amber had reached him, Lu Yi leaped onto the tiger's back and moved forward at a greater speed. Turning his head to take a look, Luoji became infuriated. Seeing as he was unable to flee, he decided to stop in his tracks and turned around to face Lu Yi. With talisman papers in both hands, he slapped one of them on his own chest, whereupon his body was engulfed in a golden light. It was a high-quality golden body talisman paper. At the same time, he cast the other talisman paper at Lu Yi. Seeing that, Lu Yi leapt off the tiger and slashed at the attack. Meanwhile, he said to Amber, "Hide somewhere else." Upon impact, he collapsed to the ground as his entire body was in pain. As soon as he got to his feet, he saw Luoji arrogantly standing on the same spot. Luoji provoked him by beckoning to him and said, "Come on." Without uttering a word, Lu Yi fished out a golden body talisman paper from his storage bag and used it on himself. Seeing that, Luoji couldn't help but heave a sigh as Lu Ye's fortune seemed to be on par with that of his own. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 82. Every dog has its day. Inside the gorge, Lu Yi and Luoji, who had little spiritual power left, started competing against one another using talisman papers. As these different talisman papers were activated, lights of different colors expanded. The noises reverberated the place and attracted the attention of the cultivators from 2 nearby sects. Upon seeing what was going on from afar, no one dared to go over. There was no way they could butt in on such an intense battle. If they were not careful enough, they'd be dragged into the battle and get killed. A 5th-order cultivator might be able to interfere in this battle. However, there were not many 5th-order cultivators in either sect to begin with. Since the war started, the 5th-order cultivators from both sects had been clamping down on each other in Split Sky Gorge, so none of them were able to go away. That was the reason Lu Yi hadn't come across any 5th-order cultivators in the past few days. It was already morning at the moment. Lu Yi panted heavily as he had never expected that the battle would lead him to end up in such a state. Nevertheless, the dawn of hope was right before his eyes because he realized that his enemy had no more talisman papers for attacks. That wasn't surprising because Luoji was a spell cultivator who had mastered some low-rank spell techniques. The spells he was able to cast were more powerful than ordinary talisman papers. Therefore, he had fewer than 10 offensive talisman papers with him. Most of his talisman papers were for defense. After an intense battle with Lu Yi, he had used up all of his offensive talisman papers, which made him feel humiliated. He was taught that a spell cultivator shouldn't even use talisman papers because that was a sign of incompetence, but now, he would rather be called incompetent than get killed by a reckless guy. Seeing as Lu Yi was charging towards him with a sword, he felt horrified and immediately turned around to flee. However, he could hear that Lu Yi was getting closer to him. Turning his head, he realized that Lu Yi was riding on the snow-white tiger again. How shameless! He secretly cursed. At the same time he barked, "Stop running after me. Otherwise, I'll teach you a lesson." Certainly, Lu Yi wouldn't care about such a laughable threat as the tiger charged forward at a greater speed. "You're forcing me to do it," Luoji said through clenched teeth. Upon whirling around to face Lu Yi, he fished out something from his storage bag. Lu Yi had no idea what Luo Ji had taken out, but the latter's posture made him feel that he was in danger. While he was in his thoughts, Luo Ji had tossed the thing at him. Upon closer look, he realized that it was a square seal the size of a palm. The seal was translucent and white, but it wasn't certain what material it was made from. However, the next instant, he felt a chill running down his spine as the petite seal expanded to be as large as a table before coming at Amber. An agile Amber changed its direction and dodged the seal with Lu Yi on its back. With a loud boom, a 60 centimeters deep pit appeared on the ground where the seal landed. Following that, the ground seemed to be shaking. Lu Yi's eyelids twitched when he saw that. This thing must be an incredible artifact. If he and Amber were struck by it earlier, they would have become mashed meat. Amber attempted to bring Lu Yi to pounce on Luo Ji. However, even though the seal was large, it was actually dexterous. It repeatedly fell from the sky as the tiger dodged it with difficulty. There were times when they almost got struck by it. "Run!" Lu Yi, who was on Amber's back, yelled. Knowing that the situation wasn't in their favor, the tiger turned around and fled from the scene with Lu Yi. "Where do you think you're going?" A relentless Luo Ji put on a frenzied grin. "Wasn't it fun racing after me? Come fight with me, reckless brat." The situation had flipped around. Earlier it was Lu Yi who was racing after Luo Ji, but now it was Luo Ji who was trying to kill Lu Yi. It could be said that every dog had its day, and no one could always be on the lucky side. Boom. 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 Every time the seal landed, the ground would tremble, which caused the rocks to scatter everywhere. This artifact was supposed to be Luo Ji's trump card. He hadn't used it earlier because he was confident of his capabilities, and it also had something to do with his pride. However, after he was pushed over the edge by Lu Yi, he broke free from his psychological restraints. Since he had used talisman papers, it made no difference to also use an artifact. The speed at which the seal landed became increasingly faster. The huge impact made it difficult for Amber to flee. Eventually, the tiger fell to the ground upon impact. The seal immediately hovered above it and shaded the sunlight. Hurriedly, Amber got to its feet, but it was too late. At the most critical moment, Lu Yi activated his spiritual power, which was running low, and formed a defensive spiritual pattern to protect the tiger and him. As the seal landed, the spiritual pattern only lasted for a short moment before it fell apart. Following that, the second layer of defense took shape and broke apart again. Then the third one appeared. Finally, he managed to shut out the seal. After just a moment of deadlock, the light around the seal dimmed as it shrunk to its original size. Then all its light went out. Lu Yi raised his hand to grab the seal, but he missed the target because his hand was trembling violently from exhaustion. The seal landed on his head and caused a bump on it, but fortunately, the seal had lost all its power. Following a laugh from a distance, the seal whooshed back into Luo Ji's hand. Presently, they were about 100 meters apart. A sloven Luo Ji leaned against a boulder and stared at Lu Yi with a laugh, as though he had won the battle. There were countless holes on the ground in the gorge they were in. The repercussions of the battle had died down, but the battle was far from over. Lu Yi got to his feet with difficulty as he dragged his feet towards Luo Ji, which wiped the smile off the latter's face. However, after taking just a few steps forward, he collapsed to the ground and made the dust rise. Seeing that, he dashed towards him and helped him up. As their eyes met, she looked inquisitively at Lu Yi, who shook his head slowly. Seeing as Luo Ji was in a terrible state, he intended to join forces with Amber and get rid of their enemy for good. Nevertheless, Lu Yi felt that even though Luo Ji looked like he was on his last legs, he might still be able to use 1 to 2 spells. It was difficult to deal with his big seal as well. Lu Yi had used 3 spiritual patterns earlier, but he still almost couldn't ward off the seal, not to mention that Amber and Yi were much weaker than he was. If they were struck by the seal, they would immediately lose their lives. There was no doubt that Luo Ji was a wicked man, which was evident in what he had done during the battle. Such a man wouldn't really have exhausted himself when he was fully aware that Lu Yi had 2 helpers. Lu Yi even suspected that even if he walked up to Luo Ji, he still couldn't kill him. He was the one who was really on his last legs. From a distance, Luo Ji observed them with a cold gaze. Seeing as Yi and Amber didn't seize the chance to kill him, there seemed to be a tinge of disappointment behind his gaze, but at the same time, he heaved a sigh of relief. Just like what Lu Yi had expected, even though he seemed to have used up his power, he wouldn't mind showing Yi and Amber the heritage of a disciple from a top sect if they dared to come near him. The present outcome was the best as he didn't need to use his last bit of power to deal with two insignificant helpers. Raising his head, he yelled at Lu Yi, "After I take a rest for a bit, I'll definitely kill you." Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 83, Goodwill from Mystic Sect. In the station of 9-Star Clan, Chao Yi and Dong Shu Yi were waiting together. On the previous night, they had learned that Luo Ji and Mountain Tiger had traded moves. One of them was a second-order cultivator while the other was a third-order cultivator. However, their battle was as violent as that between two fifth-order cultivators. Then they were shocked to learn that Luo Ji, whom they had high hopes of, wasn't able to settle their enemy quickly. Instead, he and Lu Yi had fallen into a deadlock. Lu Yi indeed lived up to his name as a disciple from a top sect. It wasn't so easy to kill him. If it was just a normal grudge between them, those from 9-Star Clan would have let him off. However, they must get revenge for their young master, so they could only wait. Just then Dong Shu Ye's expression changed. "Is there any outcome?" Chao Yi asked anxiously. "No. That bitch who works for Wang Yang. She has left the Mystic Sect station." "Is she going to deal with Luo Ji?" Chao Ye's heart sank. "I don't know, but we can't rule out that possibility. You'll have to go over." At that, Chao Ye's face twitched. Although both of them were sixth-order cultivators, he was no match for that woman. Every time he traded moves with her, he would end up getting beaten up. This couldn't be helped, as he was a body-tempering cultivator while that woman was a spell cultivator, which was why she was naturally at an advantage. In the past 2 years they had battled against one another several times, but he'd always end up getting assaulted. Therefore, he wasn't willing to face that maidservant called Xiao Zhu. However, since Dong Shu Yi had said so, he had no choice but to execute the order. "Well, I'll just get beaten up one more time." With this thought in his mind, he strode out of the place with a resolute expression on his face. Dong Shu Yi watched him leave and heaved a sigh. Presently, Chu Tian was taking a rest with other junior brothers and sisters in a hidden place. Just then, a woman with 2 buns on her head shuffled towards them. Seeing her, Chu Tian hurriedly greeted her by saying, "Senior sister Xiao Zhu." Xiao Zhu walked over and asked, "How is it going?" She was asking about Lu Yi instead of Chu Tian and the others. Since those from 9-Star Clan could find out that Lu Yi and Luo Ji were in an intense battle, those from Mystic Sect could do that as well. Therefore, everyone was aware that these 2 disciples, who were from some of the top great forces, were in a life-and-death battle. Still reeling from the shock, Chu Tian replied. Their brains almost spurted out. "Senior sister Xiao Zhu, those 2 can't even be considered humans." "Who has got the upper hand?" Xiao Zhu questioned. Chu Tian shook his head. "They're equally matched. Sometimes one would race after the other one, and the next instant it had become the other way round." "Have they been battling against one another since last night?" Xiao Zhu furrowed her brows. "They don't keep fighting all the time. Sometimes they'd take a break to recuperate, but they'd soon get into a scuffle again." Chu Tian had apparently gathered quite some information. Their restorative powers. Xiao Zhu was astounded. For cultivators in the second order and the third order, their restorative powers were unbelievable. Most people couldn't last for such a long time in a battle. "Where are they?" she asked. After Chu Tian pointed out the direction for her, she started striding forward. A moment later, Lu Yi and Luo Ji, who were in an intense battle, vigilantly turned to look in a particular direction at the same time. This had been a maniacal battle as both of them were on their last legs. After taking a rest for about 2 hours to restore their energy, Luo Ji was the first one to launch an attack and ignited the second round. However, this time they didn't use any talisman papers because they had no more offensive talisman papers left. They only had some defensive talisman papers. On the other hand, Luo Ji also never activated the big seal again because that would consume a lot of his energy. The small amount of spiritual power he had restored wasn't enough to sustain using the artifact. If he couldn't kill Lu Yi quickly, he would be waiting for death. Now he even stopped using other spells as he only traded moves with Lu Yi using his icicle technique. It was because he was most adept at this technique, and he'd be able to consume less energy with this one. In fact, there were no grudges between the two of them, and they had never met one another prior to this. However, battles on Spirit Creek battlefield had nothing to do with grudges. It had everything to do with whose side they were on. Since they were from different sides, that was a good enough reason to kill one another. As they watched attentively, a curvy figure approached them from a distance. Luoji immediately felt his chest tightening because he realized that the person wasn't from 9-Star Clan. However, the next moment, he was able to be at ease because immediately after the woman appeared, another burly figure also arrived at this place. He was Chao Yi from 9-Star Clan. The fact that 2 6th-order cultivators suddenly appeared in this place puzzled Luoji, so he looked inquisitively at Chao Yi, who shook his head and motioned for him to stay calm before standing beside him. It was then Luoji realized that Chao Yi was here to restrict the other party, so he seized the chance and sat down with his legs crossed before fishing out some pills to consume them. On the other hand, Lu Yi had no idea what was going on, but upon seeing what Luoji was doing, he also gulped down some pills and fished out a big chunk of meat to eat. Then, he tossed another piece of meat at the tiger beside him. A speechless Xiaozhu stood in front of Lu Yi, and as he stared vigilantly at her, she introduced herself by saying, "I'm Chu Tian's senior sister." Certainly, Lu Yi wouldn't readily believe her, so he immediately sent a message to Chu Tian to inquire about it. Upon getting his confirmation, he nodded slightly and murmured, "What's wrong?" At the same time, he sized her up and took a brief glance at her plump chest. He couldn't help wondering why this woman was dressed up like a maidservant. "Give me 2 spirit stones," Xiaozhu uttered. "What?" Lu Yi thought he had heard it wrongly. 2 spirit stones. She repeated herself. A puzzled Lu Yi didn't understand why this woman came all the way here to demand 2 spirit stones from him. Was she trying to rob him? That was practically impossible. After giving it a thought, he fished out 2 stones from his storage bag and tossed them at her. After taking them, Xiaozhu threw a jade slip at him. "You've bought it now." With a frown, Lu Yi took the jade slip and scanned it, whereupon he immediately understood what this woman was doing. This jade slip was actually an earth-grade cultivation technique. Certainly, 2 spirit stones were not enough to buy an earth-grade cultivation technique. This was apparently how those from Mystic Sect expressed their goodwill. Whatever the case, he had saved some disciples who were from Mystic Sect recently. This came as a surprise to him. Previously, he had contacted Chu Tian in an attempt to buy a black-grade cultivation technique. Naturally, an earth-grade one was much better, which would allow him to open up to 180 spiritual points, and he wouldn't need to look for a new cultivation technique upon ascending to the 6th order. "Thanks," he said. A nonchalant Xiaozhu turned around and flashed a smile at Chao Yi, who wasn't far away. Chao Yi felt a crawling sensation on his scalp as terrible memories from the past sprang back into his mind. However, Luoji was just beside him, so he couldn't appear weak. After taking a step forward, he uttered, "Why don't we go to a different place?" The grin on Xiaozhu's face widened. "That's what I thought as well." The next instant, Chao Yi turned around and flew away at an incredible speed. Seeing that, Xiaozhu leaped into the air and raced after him. After both of them disappeared, Lu Yi hurriedly swallowed the food in his mouth and picked up his sword before pouncing on Luoji. At the same time, countless battles that were more violent than the previous ones were ignited in different parts of Split Sky Gorge. The cultivators from both sects clashed with one another as more and more of them lost their lives. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 84. I can definitely defeat him. 3 days later, on a battlefield where the ground was covered in holes, Lu Yi and Luoji were several dozen meters apart as they recuperated on their own. During this period of time, they had battled against one another for over a dozen times. They had practically fought with each other a few times every day, but no one had yet to emerge as a winner until now. 3 days of intense battles had made Lu Yi extremely exhausted as he hadn't had much time to sleep. He didn't understand how this guy called Luoji was able to restore his energy so quickly. After such a long time, they had basically used up their trump cards. None of them could defeat the other party by fighting head-on, So the speed at which they recovered was immensely important. Given the same period of time, if one of them could restore more spiritual power, he could slowly make the situation tilt in his favor. With the help of Gluttonous Feast, Lu Yi was able to refine pills at twice the speed. When he took a break, he would also build a gathering spirit spiritual pattern around his spiritual points to absorb the world's spiritual chi around him. With two techniques that he could deploy, it could be said that the speed at which he recovered was incredible. Most sixth-order cultivators wouldn't be able to recover as fast as he could. On the other hand, Luoji also had the same doubts as he secretly cursed at Lu Yi. How does this reckless guy recover so quickly? Although he was just a second-order Spirit Creek Realm Master, he had opened up 55 spiritual points, which was twice the amount of what Lu Yi had achieved. Moreover, the pills he had been consuming were not the ordinary spirit restoring pills. These were small returning pills specially made on Infinite Island. These pills worked just like spirit restoring pills when used during cultivation. However, when they were used for recovery, they were more effective than spirit restoring pills by 30%. When he was restoring his energy, he also made use of spirit stones. With both hands grabbing each stone, he greedily absorbed the spiritual power contained in the stones. However, he hadn't managed to gain the upper hand by using 3 methods at the same time, so he didn't understand what was going on. Compared to Lu Yi, he had little to no rest as he couldn't really have a shut-eye in the past 3 days. That was because Amber and Yi would disturb him from time to time. Both of them were unable to fight against Luoji, but they were good at disturbing him. After each of them recuperated for about 4 hours, Lu Yi opened his eyes. Just like how they'd usually did it, it was time for the next battle. As expected, Luoji also opened his eyes and got to his feet. Staring at Lu Yi, he shuffled towards him. It wasn't that he wanted to get close to Lu Yi. It was just that the distance between them was too wide, so he needed to get into a suitable range where he could use his spells. Across from him, Lu Yi rode on top of Amber and charged towards Luoji. He was pointing his sword downwards as he was ready for a strike. Upon stopping in his tracks, Luoji prepared to use a spell as a spiritual light flashed across his hands. Just then he detected something and frowned, whereupon he raised his hand and shouted, "Wait a minute." Lu Yi furrowed his brows, but he still told Amber to stop. The spiritual light around Luoji's hands dissipated as he panted and uttered, "Stop fighting. You win." Lu Yi stared fixedly at him, wondering what the latter was up to. As though he was trying to make Lu Yi set his mind at ease, Luoji took the initiative to explain. The battle between Mystic Sect and 9-Star Clan has ended. Those from 9-Star Clan have admitted defeat and returned to their station, so I have to go as well. He was sent to deal with Lu Yi by those from 9-Star Clan. Since his clan had been defeated, it was pointless for him to stay there. Naturally, Lu Yi wouldn't easily believe him. After days of battle, he became certain that Luoji was a cunning man, so he immediately made use of the battlefield imprint to ask Chu Tian about it. After just a short moment, Chu Tian replied with a cheerful tone in his voice and confirmed what Luoji had said. During this battle, those from the Mystic Sect eventually defeated the other party. In fact, this didn't come as a surprise. Although both sects were 1 rank apart, Mystic Sect was stronger when it came to their Spirit Creek Realm Masters. Therefore, 9-Star Clan wasn't even a match for them to begin with. Previously, Lu Yi had killed many cultivators from 9-Star Clan, which helped those from Mystic Sect to gain an even bigger advantage. In the past few days, those from Mystic Sect had been slowly gaining the upper hand through the small-scale battles. Eventually, there came a moment when they destroyed 9-Star Clan and forced them to return to their station. It was then the battle between the two great forces came to an end. After Lu Yi was done with the inquiry, Luoji asked, "How was it?" Lu Yi nodded slightly and clenched his legs, whereupon Amber dashed forward and pounced on Luoji. "You!" A horrified Luoji didn't understand what was wrong with Lu Yi. The battle between both great forces had come to an end, so it was pointless for them to keep fighting against each other. Therefore, he had no idea why Lu Yi was still pouncing on him. However, he didn't have the time to ponder on this issue as Lu Yi and the tiger were about to reach him. Left with no choice, he hurriedly activated his icicle technique to deal with them. Lu Yi tilted his head to dodge the icicle and leaped off the tiger's back as he wielded his sword. There was a rarely seen hideous smile on his face. It's you who decided when to start the war, but it's me who will decide when to end it. Previously, Luoji suddenly came over and attempted to kill him. 3 days of battle had made him very infuriated. Moreover, he had consumed a lot of pills during this period of time. Prior to this, he had accumulated a substantial amount of pills, but now he was left with just over 30 pills. In the past 3 days he couldn't even cultivate, so he had practically wasted lots of time. Luoji couldn't make up for his loss by just saying that the other party had won the battle. If he couldn't get the fury out of his chest, he would never let Luoji off. 3 days of tussle had made them become familiar with each other's moves. Usually Luoji wouldn't easily allow Luyi to get close to him. However, he hadn't expected Luyi to be so obstinate, so he became astounded for a moment. When he came to his senses, it was already too late to retreat. Before the sword even reached him, he had used a golden body talisman paper on himself. When the sword, which was blessed with sharp-edged spiritual pattern, hit the layer of golden light, it was unable to break it. On the other hand, a seal appeared out of thin air and expanded to the size of a table before landing on Luyi. Hurriedly, Luyi leaped backwards, whereupon a pit appeared on the spot he was standing earlier and the ground started shaking. When he stabilized himself, Luoji was already over 100 meters away from him, and the latter had even fended off Amber and Yi's joint sneak attack. However, Luoji wouldn't dare to activate the seal for the second time as it was energy-consuming. Seizing the chance, Luyi stomped his foot on the ground and dashed towards Luoji. In a zigzag way, he dodged the icicles as the light of a defensive spiritual pattern flashed across his body from time to time. I can definitely defeat him. As long as the battle dragged on, he could certainly kill Luoji. Although the speed at which Luoji recovered was the same as or had even surpassed Luyi, he had gulped down too many spirit pills in the past few days. If a cultivator consumed too many pills in a short period of time, his spiritual power would end up becoming turbid. It was especially fatal for a spell cultivator like Luoji to have impure spiritual power. That was because the power of the spells he used would weaken, and the time he needed to activate his spells would also lengthen. Luyi was fully aware of that, which was why he insisted on continuing the fight. He didn't have to end his life this time. As long as he could force Luoji to keep exhausting his spiritual power and consuming pills to replenish his energy, the latter would become increasingly weaker. There would finally come a moment when he could hack this guy to death. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 85. I'll give you money if you spare my life. However, this battle didn't go on in the end. In the middle of the battle, Luoji bellowed, "I'll give you money if you spare my life." Apparently, he had realized the problem with himself as he couldn't keep on fighting. Presently, Luyi was unable to kill him, but if the battle dragged on, he would end up in a terrible state and eventually get killed by Luyi. Startled by the imposing shout for a moment, Luyi then pointed his sword at the front. "I want your seal." The seal must be an incredible artifact, which might be more valuable than the bell he had obtained from the young master of 9-Star Clan. Luoji chuckled and prepared for a spell technique. "Have a life-and-death battle with me. Right now." "What can you give me, then?" Luyi asked in a grim voice. In fact, he wasn't determined to kill Luoji. He just felt that he had suffered immense losses after 3 days of battle. If Luoji could make up for his losses, he wouldn't mind ending the fight. With that said, the main reason was that if they kept on fighting, he would have to pay a hefty price even if he could kill Luoji in the end. The other party wouldn't just keep on battling against him like a fool. Before the outcome became irreversible, Luoji would certainly risk his life to destroy the other party. Then Luoji fished out his seal from the storage bag and lifted the bag. "It's all yours." He's pretty generous. Luyi was surprised. However, considering that Luoji had also consumed lots of stuff in the past few days, there were probably not many things left in the bag. It was likely that there were only some pills and stones in it. Seeing as Luoji was so straightforward, Luyi wouldn't want to keep forcing him as both parties would be destroyed if this battle dragged on. After giving it a thought, he nodded. "Sure." Hearing that, Luoji directly tossed the bag at Luoyi without making him take an oath. That was because to him, even though their stances were different, they were from some of the top great forces. Therefore, he believed that the other person was a man of integrity, We've been fighting for a long time, but I don't even know your name. Yi. Luoji dipped his head and stared fixedly at Lu Yi, as though he was trying to imprint the latter's face into the deepest part of his memory. Then, he turned around and dragged his leaden feet out of the gorge. On the other hand, Lu Yi didn't seize the chance to launch a sneak attack. Although Luoji appeared to have put his guard down, the seal in his hand was radiating a faint glow. If Lu Yi chose to go back on his word, he'd be forcing Luoji to fight with him until one of them perished. After walking for a long time, Luoji looked up at the sky with a sorrowful expression. In fact, he had suffered immense losses. The things he had lost in the storage bag didn't matter. As a disciple from Infinite Island, he didn't care about it. The crux of the problem was that he had consumed too many pills recently, which made the spiritual power in his body become turbid. It would take him at least 1 month to restore his spiritual power to its original state. In other words, he couldn't cultivate in the next month, which had a huge impact on any low-rank cultivators, especially a cultivator like him who was from a top great force. With that said, he had lost the battle, and he wouldn't blame anyone. Both of them were still low-rank cultivators, and they'd definitely meet again in the future. At that point, he'd get his revenge. After Luoji's figure was out of sight, Lu Yi let out a long breath and beckoned to Amber before riding on its back. With the tiger leading the way, they found a tunnel to take a rest. It's finally over. He had become exhausted, both physically and psychologically, from the battle. Even though it had only been a short time since he started cultivating, he had experienced tons of battles. However, he had never come across an equally matched opponent like Luoji, who was extremely difficult to deal with. In the end, it was Luoji who admitted defeat, but in fact it was Lu Yi who had lost the battle. That was because he had Amber and Yi to assist him, while Luoji was on his own. Amber and Yi were unable to directly deal with Luoji because they were wary of the seal's power. However, they could launch a sneak attack on him from time to time. Because of what they had been doing, Luoji hadn't had any time to take a nap. On the other hand, Lu Yi had taken a few naps. It could be said that if Lu Yi was also on his own, he wouldn't have been at an advantage in such a battle. These cultivators from the top great forces were indeed extraordinary. The battle with Luoji served as a lesson for Lu Yi, that he should never judge a cultivator's power based on his realm. He wasn't even in the mood to take a look at the things inside Luoji's bag. After he was done with eating some jerky, he dozed off. Amber and Yi traded glances before shuffling to both ends of the tunnel. The war between Nine Star Clan and Mystic Sect had ended, and Luoji had admitted defeat, so they probably wouldn't come across any danger again. However, they still had to remain vigilant. Lu Yi was awakened by the noises coming from the battlefield imprint. Still in a groggy state, he opened his eyes and furrowed his brows. For some reason, he became grumpy upon waking up as he felt extremely displeased. After remaining frustrated for a bit, he checked on his battlefield imprint, and just like what he had expected, it was Chu Tian who had sent over 10 messages asking if he was around. "I'm not," he replied. In the Mystic Sect station, Chu Tian appeared puzzled as he realized that Lu Yi seemed to be in a terrible mood. After becoming startled for a while, he sent him one more message. "Brother Yi, that's funny." He had been calling him Junior Brother Yi in the past. The fact that he had changed the way he addressed him suggested that some news had been spread around Mystic Sect. Although he already knew that Lu Yi was from a top great force, Lu Yi proved to be a cultivator with huge potential by defeating Luoji. "What's the matter?" Lu Yi was trying to find out how to blacklist this guy. A moment later, he realized that he just had to remove Chu Tian's brand from his battlefield imprint. However, considering the fact that this guy was his first and only friend so far, he decided not to do it. The thing is, upon reading Chu Tian's explanation, Lu Yi learned that after those from Mystic Sect won the war, they decided to hold a celebratory banquet to reward the disciples who had done a great job. Therefore, Chu Tian wanted to invite him to come over. Regardless, Lu Yi had lent a hand to Mystic Sect in the beginning of the war. "I'm not free." Lu Yi rejected him outright. Because of the advice given to him by the sect master previously, he wasn't willing to come into contact with too many people, let alone join their celebratory banquet. Moreover, he believed that Chu Tian had only invited him out of politeness. Well, as Chu Tian read the rude message from Lu Yi in the Mystic Sect station, He realized that this man was indeed a willful person. Then he replied, "Since you're not free, I'll stop disturbing you. However, many of our junior brothers and sisters want to thank you face to face. Brother Yi, when are you leaving? I'll personally see you off." Lu Yi didn't respond to Chu Tian's message. Instead, he fished out Luo Ji's storage bag to have a look. As expected, the restriction on the bag had been lifted. Upon examining it, Lu Yi was surprised. He thought that there were not many things left in the bag, but he realized that Luo Ji was richer than he thought. There were indeed not many good things left, as these were all spirit pills, spirit stones, and some defensive talisman papers. Nevertheless, these were the things Lu Yi needed most now. There were about 30 stones. A low-rank cultivator didn't need to consume many of these, so Luo Ji had brought these stones with him just in case he needed them all of a sudden. On the other hand, there were many pills. There were 10 bottles of spirit-restoring pills and 3 bottles of a different kind of pills. In total, there were over 100 pills. Although these things were not enough to make up for the losses he had suffered in the past 3 days, it was better than nothing at all. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 86. Red Lotus Sky Mnemonic. Name Lu Yi. Identity: a disciple from Crimson Blood Sect. Cultivation: 29 spiritual points. Location: Spirit Creek Battlefield. Contribution: 142 points. Lu Yi was examining the information in his battlefield imprint. If he wasn't mistaken, before coming to Split Sky Gorge, his contribution was 34 points, but now it had become 142 points, which was an increase of 108 points. These were the points he had obtained from killing the cultivators from 9-Star Clan. If he hadn't been held up by Luo Ji for a few days, he would have obtained more. For now, he had no idea what contribution was for. Although he could ask Chu Tian about it, his secrets would be exposed by doing so. Therefore, he didn't intend to ask anyone about it. Whatever its uses were, he would find out about it after returning to the station of Crimson Blood Sect. As for his wealth, he had 10 yuan metal ores, 1 10-point map, 135 spirit restoring pills, 251 spirit stones, 31 healing pills, 22 small returning pills, 9 talisman papers, 1 bell artifact, and 4 storage bags that hadn't been opened yet. The small returning pills were from Luo Ji's bag. The name of the pills was written on the bottles. Lu Yi had seen Luo Ji use it when taking a rest, so he was certain that these pills were useful for cultivators. As for the talisman papers, they were all defensive and auxiliary ones. The 4 storage bags belonged to the young master of 9-Star Clan and his subordinates, but Lu Yi reckoned that apart from the young master's bag, the others didn't contain any valuable items. He would have to get someone else to open the bags to find out. Although he seemed to have many resources at hand, he wasn't actually wealthy. Now, he was a 3rd-order Spirit Creek Realm Master, so he needed about 15 spirit pills to open up 1 spiritual point. With the help of Gluttonous Feast and Gathering Spirits, he was able to consume fewer pills and improve his efficiency. Now, the most important thing for him was to recuperate. Even though he had become more energetic after a night's sleep, the spiritual power he had used wouldn't be restored automatically. Curious about the efficacies of the small returning pills, he took out one from the bottle and consumed it. As he used Gluttonous Feast, he refined the pill and constructed some gathering spirits around his spiritual points to restore his spiritual power. When all the spiritual points were blessed with spiritual patterns that looked like a funnel, he could clearly feel a pull around his chest and belly that could attract the world's spiritual chi around him. That was the effect of 29 gathering spirits' spiritual patterns combined. Now, he could confirm the efficacies of small returning pills. These pills were more useful than spirit-restoring pills. It was no wonder that Luo Ji would always consume these when taking a rest. He secretly cursed and thought that these disciples from top great forces indeed had a rich heritage. Even the pills they took were different. After spending 1 day and taking 6 small returning pills, he was finally able to fully restore his spiritual power. It was then he fished out the jade slip given to him by the woman with double buns from Mystic Sect and studied it. Red Lotus Sky Mnemonic was the name of this earth-grade cultivation technique. If he cultivated according to this technique, he was able to unlock up to 180 spiritual points. What surprised him was that there were a few spell techniques that came with the cultivation technique. However, these spells required the cultivator to reach a certain point in spiritual power to start cultivating, so it wasn't useful for Lu Yi at the moment. This cultivation technique was supposed to be costly, but those from Mystic Sect only sold it to him for 2 spirit stones, so it was indeed a bargain for him. Presently, he was a 3rd Order Spirit Creek Realm Master, who had opened up 29 spiritual points. In order to ascend to the 4th Order, he had to unlock 45 points. In other words, he still had another 16 points to go. Nevertheless, it was far from the truth, as there must be parts between the cultivation techniques he had studied that didn't overlap. Therefore, he had to unlock more than 16 points. After comparing the spiritual points he had unlocked and what was written in the mnemonic, he came to the conclusion that he needed to open up 18 more points before he could achieve the 4th Order. Only until then could he completely switch from Golden Liberation Technique to Red Lotus Sky Mnemonic. He estimated that he would need about 250 pills to unlock 18 points. Given the number of pills he had, it was far from enough. Fortunately, he still had spirit stones. After giving it a thought, he decided to send someone a message. That was the only person he could look for at the moment. "I'll buy some spirit restoring pills and food from you for 251 spirit stone." He wasn't willing to stay here any longer. The station of Crimson Blood Sect was far away from this place, so it'd take him a long time to arrive at his destination. Therefore, he decided to set off on his journey as soon as possible. Moreover, the sect master must be worried about his safety. When he left Green Cloud Mountain, he had only unlocked 21 spiritual points, but now it was 29 points. Amber and E had also grown their powers. He had spent about 10 days in Split Sky Gorge, so it was time he moved on. As a 3rd Order cultivator, he was already able to protect himself in the outer circle of the battlefield. As for cultivation, he could do so while heading to his destination. There shouldn't be any problem with it. He had mastered the correct way to use gathering spirits. Even if he didn't consume any pills, his spiritual power would still increase slowly. However, before he embarked on his journey, he had to trade the useless things in his possession for useful stuff. He didn't really need any spirit stones, so it'd be best if they could be traded for pills. As for food, both Amber and he were gluttons, so he had to prepare more foods well. Soon Chu Tian sent him a message. "Sure. Brother Yi, are you leaving?" He must have realized something. "Yes," Lu Yi replied. "I'll get everything ready by tomorrow morning and look for you." After the conversation with Chu Tian, Lu Yi picked up the mnemonic to study it and ascertained the location of the next spiritual point he had to unlock. Following several attempts, he was finally able to break through the barrier of the 30th point. Then, he started practicing sword wielding instead of continuing to cultivate. In the past few days, he had been in an intense battle with Luoji, so he hadn't had the time to do such a thing. However, on this day he realized that something was different. It became smoother and more natural when he wielded his sword. He had a feeling that this was the upside of his previous life and death battle. Amber and E had also returned. Since the war between the neighboring great forces had ended, it was dead silence in Split Sky Gorge. Therefore, they didn't have to worry about any potential danger. Presently, Amber was lying on its stomach. After finishing its own jerky, it waited for Lu Yi to give it more food. In the beginning, he only had to feed Amber 2 spirit restoring pills every day. But as the tiger grew in power, it had to consume more. So he'd give the beast 4 pills every day now. As for E, she didn't live on anything. She was a ghost spirit associated with the tiger. As long as the tiger became more powerful, she would become stronger as well. For hours later, Lu Yi put the sword back into the sheath and started having roast meat beside a bonfire. He also tossed 2 pills at Amber. Suddenly recalling something, he asked, "Does Amber know how to use spells?" When he was battling against Luoji in the tunnel, he went over to disturb him, but she was forced to retreat when faced with a golden arc slash. At that time she yelped in shock. Amber thought that she had been injured, so it roared at Luoji. The roar not only disturbed Luoji, but it also caused Lu Yi to feel like someone had struck him with a hammer. This was obviously not normal. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 87, Mystic Sect Goes to War. Lu Yi recalled that when he came across Amber for the first time and met with its amber pupils, His mind went blank for a moment. Then, the tiger hadn't shown any anomalies until this time. After giving it a thought, he replied, "I don't think so." Then she turned her head. "Amber, can you use any spells?" In response, Amber howled. He went on to say, "It said it can't." The corner of Lu Ye's mouth twitched as he still hadn't figured out how Yi was able to communicate with the tiger. It was amazing that she could understand the tiger through the noises it made. It was probably her unique capability as a ghost spirit. Lu Yi stopped asking as he was only curious about it upon recalling this matter. After he was done with having his meal, he started cultivating again while Amber had dozed off beside him. It remained silent throughout the night. In the station of Mystic Sect, following Lu Ye's demands, Chu Tian was collecting some pills and food from the other disciples. Because of that, word got out that the mountain tiger Yi was leaving. Before the break of dawn, Chu Tian contacted Lu Yi and confirmed his location before heading over to meet him with 2 junior brothers. After the exchange, Lu Yi obtained lots of food and about 200 spirit-restoring pills. At that moment, the sky was completely bright. After Lu Yi got onto the tiger's back, Chu Tian cupped his fists and uttered, "Goodbye. Please contact me when you're free." After Lu Yi dipped his head, Amber charged forward and went further into Split Sky Gorge. Watching Lu Yi leave, Chu Tian suddenly became envious of him because Lu Yi was carefree as a rogue cultivator. However, he came from a top-grade force, which was why he had the confidence and heritage to survive. If Chu Tian were to do the same, he wouldn't have lasted for a few months. After returning to the station with his junior brothers, he found out that Wang Yang was looking for him, so he hurriedly went over. When he arrived at his destination, he realized that something was unusual. All the people in the station had gathered together. Besides their own disciples, even the rogue cultivators that relied on their sect were also there. Presently, a few hundred people had assembled on a square. Wang Yang was standing there with a straight back, and he was holding the hilt of a sword as though he was waiting for something. The atmosphere around the place was somber. Chu Tian walked over and cupped his fists. "Senior brother, has the mountain tiger left?" Wang Yang asked. "Yes," Chu Tian replied. Wang Yang nodded slightly with a gratified expression on his face. "That's great. Join them now." He seemed to wish that Lu Yi could have left sooner. Yes. Chu Tian got into the formation as he was puzzled by the current situation. However, Wang Yang must be going to do something important by gathering everyone together. Chu Tian had a speculation in mind, but in that case there was going to be an epic battle on this day. Time went by slowly. 1 hour later, Wang Yang, who had been standing there for a long time, suddenly arched his brow and shouted, "Both Mystic Sect and 9-Star Clan have been stationed here for 30 years. During this period of time we've gotten into countless battles, and there have been deaths on both sides. The blood feud between us is basically unresolvable. Even though we've won the battle in Split Sky Gorge, we'll never be able to live a peaceful life as long as 9-Star Clan is around. Therefore, I intend to invade 9-Star Clan Station, and I hope that all of you will lend me a hand." Upon hearing that, all of them broke into commotion. It had only been 1 day since the war ended, so they were shocked to learn that Wang Yang intended to invade 9-Star Clan Station. Mystic Sect had just won the battle, so they should be celebrating their victory instead of creating trouble again at this point. It wasn't easy to raid a station, which was protected by a grand array. Without breaking the array first, they would never be able to enter the station. However, recalling what Wang Yang had been doing over the years, they realized that he must have come up with such a plan in advance. Chu Tian was the first one to raise his arms and shout, "Senior brother, I'm willing to go with you to strengthen Mystic Sect's power." The others also roared in unison, "Senior brother, we're willing to go with you to strengthen Mystic Sect's power." Standing at the front of these people, Wang Yang put on a smile. "That's great." Then he turned to look at Chu Tian. "Send a message to Mountain Tiger, and inform him that Dong Shuyi has gone over to hunt him down an hour ago." Upon hearing that, Chu Tian was astounded by the fact that Dong Shuyi was so brazen. At the same time, he was surprised by Wang Yang's ability to gather information. Dong Shuyi was the strongest cultivator, who was in charge of the 9-Star Clan Station. With him around, the station was safe. However, if he wasn't around, the defense around the station would weaken. It seemed that the death of 9-Star Clan's young master had greatly humiliated them. They could concede defeat in the war against Mystic Sect, but they were determined to kill Mountain Tiger. Otherwise, Dong Shuyi wouldn't have taken the risk to leave the station and hunt Lu Yi down. He must have left secretly lest those from Mystic Sect were given a chance to invade them. Despite that, Wang Yang had still found out about it. Apparently, they must have made some arrangements outside 9-Star Clan's station. As soon as Dong Shuyi left the place, Wang Yang would immediately receive the news. Then, Chu Tian recalled that some of the disciples were not around during the celebratory banquet on the previous night. Nevertheless, how did Dong Shuyi find out that Mountain Tiger had left? Chu Tian wasn't a fool, so he immediately realized what had happened. Someone from Mystic Sect must have leaked the news. It was no wonder that when he reported to Wang Yang regarding Mountain Tiger's demands on the previous night, the latter told him to collect the items from other disciples. It was actually easier to get the items from the headquarters. When he was collecting the pills and food, many people asked him about the reason behind it. He didn't intend to hide anything, so he told them that Lu Yi was going to leave. The disciples from Mystic Sect wouldn't share any information with 9-Star Clan, so the person who had leaked the news must be one of those rogue cultivators who had been staying in their station. While he was in his thoughts, Wang Yang suddenly stared at a particular cultivator and uttered, "Shijun, do you have anything to say?" The rogue cultivator called Shijun had his forehead drenched in sweat. With an apprehensive expression, he replied, "No." However, Wang Yang only kept gaping at him. Shijun became more anxious as he exclaimed, "Senior brother Wang, please forgive me. It seems that you really have nothing to say." Then Wang Yang flicked at the sword by his side, whereupon the sword left the sheath with a swish and turned into a beam of light. The next instant, it reached Shijun and circled around his neck, after which his body became as hard as a stone. When the sword light returned to the sheath, Shijun's head fell to the ground, and blood spurted out of his neck. Following that, the headless corpse collapsed to the ground. The turn of events caused all the rogue cultivators to be covered in cold sweat as they stared at Wang Yang in shock. There was a cold expression on Wang Yang's face when he explained, "Shijun had joined us as a rogue cultivator, but he was actually a mole from 9-Star Clan. I killed him on this day to serve as a warning, so I hope all of you will behave yourselves." All of them couldn't believe what they had heard, but recalling Shijun's last words, they realized that it was indeed the truth. The fact that Shijun had begged for mercy suggested that he was feeling guilty. "Let's go. We'll destroy the 9-Star Clan now." Wang Yang waved his hand. A moment later, hundreds of cultivators from Mystic Sect streamed out of the place, leaving the empty station behind. Humanity's Great Sage Chapter 88. We're even now. Lu Yi was riding on Amber's back with a nonchalant expression. Compared to the time when he had just left Green Cloud Mountain, he was undoubtedly more calm and collected now. Also, he was already used to such a bumpy ride, so Amber running at full speed wouldn't affect his cultivation session. Certainly, he was less efficient now than when he was able to cultivate in a serene environment. Fortunately, he had the help of gathering spirits. All 30 of his spiritual points had been blessed with gathering spirits, as they continuously attracted the world's spiritual chi in the air. As the pill was being refined in Lu Ye's stomach, and with spiritual chi streaming in, the 30th point he had just unlocked was slowly filled with spiritual power. He didn't use Gluttonous Feast because it would require some time to switch to a different technique, which was unlike when he was taking a rest after becoming exhausted from the battle with Luoji. At that time, Luoji was well within his sight, so he could immediately find out and use a different technique should Luoji make a move. However, it was impossible to do that when he was on the go, as an accident might happen at any moment. Maybe in just 10 breaths' time, when he had to use a different technique, he would come across danger. By keeping the Golden Liberation technique running, he was better prepared to react to any turn of events. The only thing he had to sacrifice was the speed at which he cultivated, which was no big deal. He made some calculations and realized the pills he had were enough to last him until he ascended to the 4th Order Spirit Creek realm. Certainly, that was assuming that there was no additional consumption. If he got into a scuffle again, he would need to use more pills. Besides that, Amber also needed some pills every day. 1 hour ago, He had left Split Sky Gorge as Amber's speed was truly incredible. Referring to the 10-point map and the instructions in the battlefield imprint, Lu Yi pointed out a direction for Amber and let it run. While he was enjoying the ride, he suddenly frowned and took a look at the battlefield imprint. Why has Chu Tian contacted me again? However, after he was done with reading the message, his expression changed drastically, whereupon he landed a slap on the tiger's back and yelled, "Amber, run! Someone is racing after us." Hearing that, Amber immediately hastened its pace, which almost caused Lu Yi to fall off its back. He stuck out her head from the tiger's back and asked in a grim voice, "Did Chu Tian from Mystic Sect send you a message? Who is coming after us? What's the person's cultivation?" A 7th Order Spirit Creek Realm Master called Dong Shuyi, Lu Yi replied. When he was killing the disciples from 9-Star Clan in Split Sky Gorge, he hadn't even come across a single 5th Order cultivator. He thought that he hadn't seen any strong cultivators because he was in the outer circle of the battlefield. However, it wasn't until he met the woman with double buns and the burly man from 9-Star Clan that he realized that it wasn't the truth. Although he had no idea how powerful they were definitely above the 5th Order. It was then he realized that it wasn't that there were no cultivators above the 5th Order in the outer circle. The reason he hadn't seen any one of them prior to that was that the two great forces had been tying each other down. A 7th Order cultivator must be a mainstay in any great force. The fact that such a person was coming all the way to hunt him down suggested that those from 9-Star Clan were determined to get him killed. Presently, there was an extremely solemn expression on Lu Ye's face. Although he couldn't really defeat Luo Ji, he was confident that he could even deal with a 5th Order cultivator if he ever came across one. Nevertheless, if his opponent was a 7th Order cultivator, he would never be able to resist. Upon realizing the severity of the matter, Yi urged Amber to run faster. Amber expended all its energy to run at the speed of lightning, as the wind howled and the view around them moved backwards rapidly. Seeing a new message in his battlefield imprint, Lu Yi quickly read it. "Hang in there, brother Yi. Dong Shu Yi won't stay at your place for too long." "What do you mean?" Lu Yi hurriedly asked. At this moment, Chu Tian was walking alongside Wang Yang, as those from Mystic Sect were about to launch a sneak attack on 9-Star Clan. He was in a dilemma as he wasn't sure how to explain it to Lu Yi. In fact, they had made use of Lu Yi because they deliberately let word get out that Lu Yi was leaving Split Sky Gorge, which prompted Dong Shuyi to hunt him down. However, Chu Tian couldn't explicitly tell him what had happened as it would only irritate him. The mountain tiger came from a top great force. As long as he could survive, he would certainly make a name for himself in the future. Offending him at this point would do no good for Mystic Sect. Just then Wang Yang was heard saying, "Just tell him the truth as it is. Since we've done such a thing, we shouldn't be afraid to let him know. If he's clever enough, he'll know what to do." Upon getting Wang Yang's permission, Chu Tian pulled himself together and sent another message. "All of us are heading to 9-Star Clan Station at this moment. As soon as Dong Shuyi receives the news, he will immediately come back here. So brother Yi, you must try your best to survive." Looking at the message, Lu Yi was somewhat doubtful. The mainstay of 9-Star Clan, Dong Shuyi, had just left his place to hunt him down, but on the other hand, those from Mystic Sect went all out to launch an attack on their enemy's station, which was too coincidental. It was as though those from Mystic Sect had been waiting for this chance. Moreover, they had even invited him to join the celebratory banquet on the previous night. Lu Yi had no idea whether they would be able to occupy the 9-Star Clan station, but since they had decided to do so, they must have some confidence in achieving their goal. When he was still in Split Sky Gorge, it was inconvenient for Dong Shuyi to make a move because they were too close to the Mystic Sect station, which might prompt them to intervene. Therefore, if Dong Shuyi wanted to kill Lu Yi, he had to wait for the latter to leave Split Sky Gorge first. However, only Chu Tian was aware that Lu Yi was leaving. How did Dong Shuyi find out about it and race after him? Have they made use of me? That was the only possibility Lu Yi could think of. After giving it a thought, he sent a message to Chu Tian. "We're even now." Then, he decidedly blacklisted him. Although he was pretty sure that he had been used, he didn't blame anyone. In fact, he was the one who had ignited the war in Split Sky Gorge. The fact that he had killed the young master of 9-Star Clan had caused the two great forces to clash with one another. If Mystic Sect hadn't interfered in this matter, given 9-Star Clan's heritage, Lu Yi might not be able to counter them. At the very least, he had to deal with a large number of cultivators, some of whom were fifth-order cultivators. Mystic Sect's intervention had spared Lu Yi the fate of facing the entire great force on his own. After the war commenced, he had saved quite some disciples from Mystic Sect, but he had never looted anything on the battlefield. He had only demanded some useful pills and stones from the disciples he had saved. It could be said that Lu Yi and the disciples from Mystic Sect had been helping one another out. Therefore, even though those from Mystic Sect had taken advantage of him in the end, he wouldn't blame them as he was the one who had caused the trouble. His connection with Mystic Sect should stop here. Anyway, those from Mystic Sect had lent him a hand, and he had saved their disciples. He had also gotten an earth-grade cultivation technique from them, which solved an urgent problem. Now that he had been used, he reckoned that they were even and they should stop contacting one another. Walking alongside those from Mystic Sect, Chu Tian sported a bitter expression and heaved a sigh. What did he say? Wang Yang was hurt saying. Chu Tian replied honestly. He said that we're even now, and removed my brand from his imprint. That made Chu Tian feel dejected. After all, Lu Yi was from a top-grade force, so the average person rarely had the chance to come into contact with him. Wang Yang's lips curved into a smile. He's a clever person. Interesting. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 89, I Hate Spell Cultivators. Outside Split Sky Gorge was a large area of flatland, which was a disadvantageous environment for the current situation Lu Yi was in, as there was nowhere he could hide. Upon going through the 10-point map, he realized that there was a mountain after crossing the flatland. There was a river on the other side of the mountain. From there, he had to keep going for several dozen kilometers before he could reach a town. I have to head to the mountain. Lu Yi immediately made a decision. He wasn't sure how powerful a 7th-order Spirit Creek Realm Master truly was, but given the situation he was in, he would only stand a chance to survive by heading to the mountain. However, the mountain was pretty far away from this place. Given Amber's speed, it would still take him 2 hours before arriving at his destination. He secretly prayed that Dong Shuyi wouldn't run too fast. While he was still in his thoughts, he felt as though a blade had been pressed against his back. Turning his head, he was astounded to see a beam of light coming at him at full speed from the gorge. Without even the need to think about it, he knew that the beam of light must be Dong Shuyi. Although they were still far apart, Dong Shuyi could still clearly see Lu Yi, who was on Amber's back, at first glance and targeted him with a pair of eyes as sharp as those from an eagle. The feeling of a blade that had been pressed against his back was Dong Shuyi's murderous intent. He can fly. Lu Yi felt his chest tightening. He thought that by relying on Amber, he could possibly get rid of Dong Shuyi. After all, Amber was pretty swift when it was running. Moreover, the tiger was doing its best given the danger they were facing. However, he had never expected that Dong Shuyi could fly. The situation wasn't in his favor because they were running on the ground while their opponent was flying in the sky. Apparently, Amber was unable to outpace him. Just then, Dong Shuyi suddenly landed on the ground. Before Lu Yi could understand what was going on, Dong Shuyi shot into the sky again and continued chasing him. A moment later, he finally realized that Dong Shuyi was gliding instead of flying. Every time he glided, he could move for 300 meters, which was much faster than Amber. The situation wasn't as terrible as he thought, but he couldn't afford to be optimistic either. The gap between them was shortening. If this went on, Dong Shuyi would reach them in an hour. A 7th-order cultivator was indeed extraordinary. The reason Dong Shuyi decided to hunt him down was that he was confident of achieving his goal. I must come up with a solution. After giving it a thought, Lu Yi fished out a talisman paper from his storage bag. Presently, he was left with 9 talisman papers. 3 days of battle against Luoji had made him use a large number of talisman papers. The ones he had now were all defensive and auxiliary. The talisman paper he had taken out was called Move with the Wind, which was an auxiliary one that could increase one's speed. He hadn't had the chance to use it in the past, but it proved to be useful at this point. Then, he activated his spiritual power and slapped the talisman paper on Amber. The next instant, a layer of spiritual light surrounded the tiger before it gathered on the beast's feet. At that moment, Amber felt significantly lighter. With the help of the spiritual light, the tiger was able to run even faster. Although they still couldn't get rid of Dong Shuyi, they could stall for more time. The pursuit went on as they moved closer to the mountain. The murderous intent behind Dong Shuyi's eyes seemed to have materialized and erupted like a volcano. He thought that he could easily kill Lu Yi by personally coming all the way here. However, he had underestimated the Snow-White Tiger's speed. Now, Lu Yi had also used a talisman paper, which made it more difficult for him to run after them. Nevertheless, it didn't hinder Dong Shuyi's determination to kill Lu Yi. The young master was killed under his watch. Upon learning about it, those old guys from the clan were infuriated. The clan master was especially incensed as he had given the order that his son, who was basically useless, couldn't be killed for nothing. The murderer must die. If it weren't because Cloud River Realm masters were not allowed to enter Spirit Creek battlefield, Dong Shuyi believed that the clan master would have stormed into this place. Because of the useless young master's death, Dong Shuyi had been reprimanded. The fact that they had lost the battle against Mystic Sect had also weakened his authority in the clan. If he could avenge the young master's death, he might be able to keep his position. If he couldn't, it would be difficult for him to have any say at all in the clan. Therefore, the murderer must be killed. So what if Lu Yi had used a talisman paper? He still couldn't get rid of Dong Shuyi. The gap between them was shortening. When Dong Shuyi finally reached a suitable location, he would be able to end Lu Yi's life with a spell. 1 hour later, there was only a distance of 3 kilometers between them. The power of move with the wind had been exhausted. Lu Yi fished out another one and slapped it on Amber. This was the last move with the wind talisman paper he had. The sect master had only prepared 2 of these for him. 1 more hour later, the mountain in front of them became clearer. It would only take them another 15 minutes before Amber could bring Lu Yi to reach the mountain. By then, it would be easier for them to go into hiding. However, Dong Shuyi was only 900 meters away from them now, which was a dangerous distance. Lu Yi felt his heart pounding against his chest. There was an indescribable pressure that made it difficult for him to breathe. 600 meters, 300 meters. Lu Yi felt a very strong fluctuation of spiritual power behind him. Turning his head, he saw that Dong Shuyi, who was gliding in the air, pointed at him with one hand. There was a red disc made of spiritual power that was spinning around in front of him. Those from Mystic Sect have gone all out to attack the 9-star clan station. How do you still have the time to race after me? Lu Yi hurriedly yelled. Since those from Mystic Sect had made use of him, he didn't have to hide the news for them. At this critical moment, he had to stall for more time with any ways he could think of. Upon hearing that, Dong Shuyi became startled for a moment as his instincts told him that Lu Yi wasn't lying. As his mind was elsewhere, the disc in front of him became unstable as well. Following that, he bellowed, "How dare you spout nonsense to distract me? Go to hell!" His spiritual light expanded as a lot of fist-sized fireballs came at Lu Yi like a meteor shower. There were probably several dozen fireballs as they were about to strike their target. Lu Yi's eyelids twitched when he saw that. He knew that it was difficult to deal with a 7th-order cultivator, but he hadn't expected that Dong Shuyi was this powerful. Moreover, Dong Shuyi's moves suggested that he was a spell cultivator. Luoji was also a spell cultivator. I hate spell cultivators. Lu Yi gritted his teeth. Then he turned around on the tiger's back to face his opponent. With his hand firmly holding the hilt, he focused on countering the attack. As the fireballs landed on the ground, Amber zigzagged forward to dodge them. The fireballs were extremely powerful as they immediately formed many pits on the ground. The pits were still seen burning with flames. If they were struck with such an attack, their skin would have been burned even if they survived. On the tiger's back, Lu Yi continuously slashed at the fireballs as the defensive spiritual pattern kept flickering. The fireballs Amber was unable to dodge were either cut open or fended off by him. The sparkles caused him to feel immense pain. Amber also kept wailing as the smell of roast meat exuded from its body. After all the fireballs landed, Lu Yi felt fortunate that besides some burns on their bodies, he and Amber were fine. However, his hand, which was holding the sword, was trembling violently. It wasn't so easy to slash a 7th-order cultivator's spell. The spell was meant to cover a large area in an attempt to kill Lu Yi in one go. So the power of the spell had been scattered. Nevertheless, Lu Yi had to fully use his power to fend off every fireball that came at him. This time Dong Shuyi had only hastily used a spell. What if he decided to fully use his power? By then there was no way Lu Yi could survive. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 90, Running for Their Lives. While Lu Yi was suffering terribly, Dong Shuyi was surprised that he hadn't managed to kill Lu Yi with his spell. It was then he realized that Luoji wasn't lying. He wasn't certain which great force Lu Yi was from, but the latter was able to use spiritual patterns in a battle. He had seen a spiritual pattern that looked like a shield which shone and fended off his fireballs. It was no wonder that someone like Luoji had lost the battle. Upon Luoji's return, Dong Shuyi asked him what had happened and found out that he had lost the battle. Initially, he thought that Luoji hadn't done his best, but now it seemed that he had wronged him. Nevertheless, he was different from Luoji after all. Luoji came from a wealthier background, and he had been studying a heaven-grade cultivation technique. However, his biggest problem was his weak cultivation. As a 7th-order cultivator, Dong Shuyi had more moves to deal with his opponent. After he activated his spiritual power, a fireball the size of a washbasin appeared in front of him, whereupon it shot towards Lu Yi at an incredible speed. "I'll see how you're going to ward this one off." Seeing as the fireball was about to hit him, Lu Yi felt a crawling sensation on his scalp. Although there were many fireballs earlier, they were only the size of a fist. Therefore, he could still fend them off with some difficulty. However, how was he going to drive off a washbasin-sized fireball? "Amber!" he yelled. Amber hastened its pace and leaped forward. The huge fireball descended from the sky and almost struck the tiger's backside. The scorching heat made Lu Yi feel an immense pain on his face. The spiritual pattern was unable to help him with it as he caught a whiff of a burnt smell from hair. He felt fortunate that even though this thing was big, it was slightly slower than the smaller fireballs earlier. Otherwise, Amber wouldn't have been able to dodge it. However, the next instant, his expression changed because the big fireball didn't land on the ground. Instead, it changed direction and raced after them. This thing can change direction. Dong Shuyi was gliding in midair with one hand behind his back while performing a hand seal with his other hand. His hair and clothes swayed with the wind, which made him look as light as a feather. Nonetheless, the spiritual power surged around him as he was engulfed in a murderous intent. The huge fireball became increasingly faster and was about to hit its target. Lu Yi knew that if he still couldn't come up with a solution, he and Amber would lose their lives in this place. After taking a deep breath, he put his sword back in its sheath and raised both of his hands. As he activated his spiritual power, a defensive spiritual pattern appeared in front of him. Apparently it wasn't enough. It was already difficult for the spiritual pattern to fend off the fireballs earlier, let alone such a large one. However, as Lu Yi madly infused his spiritual power into it, the palm-sized defensive spiritual pattern expanded into a table-sized one in a short period of time. A very intricate pattern was flowing around on the spiritual pattern as it radiated a glow. At that instant, Lu Yi felt as though all his energy had left his body. Although he hadn't had the time to check on himself, he knew that this spiritual pattern must have cost him 30% of his spiritual power. In other words, he could only use this spiritual pattern 3 times before his spiritual power would be depleted. He had never activated this spiritual pattern before. In the past, he would only need a short moment to use sharp edge or protection. There was one common trait about spiritual patterns. As long as there was enough spiritual power to sustain it, the spiritual pattern would keep going. The reason Gathering Spirits was able to sustain itself was that it had the ability to attract the world's spiritual chi around it, which allowed it to keep existing. The substantial fireball struck the defensive spiritual pattern and sent an immense force across it. Upon impact, Amber was almost forced on its knees. The muscles on Lu Ye's arms had become swollen as though he was trying to hold out against an extremely heavy object. The The scorching heat came right at his face. Sparkles emitting from the fireball caused the glow on the spiritual pattern to turn dim rapidly. Even though he was still infusing his spiritual power into it, he couldn't last for a long time. With that said, he was able to slightly set his mind at ease as he had successfully parried the strike. Now he was ready to tilt the spiritual pattern to drive off the fireball. However, before he could make a move, Dong Shuyi was heard snorting from a distance. How foolish! Then he used a different hand seal. The fireball exploded with a loud boom as the flames swept across the place. The expansive void seemed to have contorted, and the trees around them started burning. Is he dead? With a cold gaze, Dong Shuyi landed on the ground and took a glance. Normally, there was no way a third-order cultivator could parry even one spell from him. However, the person he had to kill wasn't the average third-order cultivator. This guy was from an unknown top-grade force, and his mastery of spiritual patterns was awe-inspiring. Right then, a rustle was heard coming from the forest as it went further away. He's not dead. The eyelids of Dong Shuyi twitched as his murderous intent surged. Just when he was ready to race after him, he realized there was a new message on his battlefield imprint. Initially, he wanted to ignore it, but upon recalling what Lu Yi had said earlier, he felt his chest tightening and immediately took a glance. It was a brief message from Chao Yi, but upon reading it, he felt his heart sinking. Wang Yang is leading 600 cultivators from Mystic Sect to launch an attack on our station. Senior brother, please come back quickly. If he hadn't managed to get close to Lu Yi, he would have immediately returned to the station upon seeing the message. However, Lu Yi was well within his reach now, so he wasn't willing to give up at this point. Therefore, upon making up his mind, he sent a message back to Chao Yi. The clan-defending Grand Array of 9-Star Clan had been activated. All the important places were guarded by cultivators as they got ready to face their enemies. No one in 9-Star Clan could have expected that those from Mystic Sect would go all out to raid them. After all, they had only recently gone to war, and it was 9-Star Clan that conceded defeat in the end. Chao Yi didn't understand what Wang Yang was trying to achieve. However, things were already happening. As the strongest cultivator in this station at the moment, Chao Yi had the responsibility to lead the cultivators in the station to fend off their enemies. Nevertheless, he couldn't do it on his own, which was why he immediately sent a message to Dong Shuyi to inform him about it. However, Dong Shuyi's reply made him feel helpless. His message was, "Hang in there." What else could Chao Yi do apart from trying his best to persevere? Tons of spirit stones were needed to keep the Grand Array running, which served as a force of defense to ward off the cultivators from Mystic Sect. According to Chao Yi's estimation, they could resist the attack from Mystic Sect for about 1 to 2 days. Hence, even though 9-Star Clan was besieged, those in the station were only slightly anxious. They were not flustered at all. Fuck Wang Yang. Chao Yi secretly cursed as he had no idea what had gotten into that guy. Just then, a disciple came over in a nervous manner and reported something to Chao Yi, who became shocked and strode out of the hall, only to see a figure hurriedly coming in his direction. That person was holding the hand of a woman in purple clothes. Luoji. Chao Yi bellowed before he leaped into the air and landed in front of the person. Then, he took a look at the person and the woman in purple clothes behind him. What are you doing? With a frown, Luoji replied, I'm leaving. A puzzled Chao Yi asked, Huh? Where are you going at this point? Of course I'm leaving this place. Should I be waiting for death then? Luoji gazed at him like he was a fool. Chao Yi furrowed his brow as he had no idea what Luoji meant, but he still came into his way. You can leave, but why are you bringing Zi with you? Luoji uttered, From now on, she's no longer a disciple from 9-Star Clan. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 91. A Furious Chao Yi. Upon hearing that, Chao Yi was infuriated. She has been raised in the 9-Star Clan? Who are you to say that she is no longer one of us? If the one we raise is not one of us, then what is she? A disciple of Infinite Island? He was already hard-pressed because their station was besieged by those from Mystic Sect, so he was truly incensed upon seeing the fuss Luoji was making. If it weren't because Luoji came from a powerful background, He would have taught him a lesson instead of letting him keep causing trouble. Luoji uttered impassively, "That's right. Z has agreed to leave with me, so she has nothing to do with your clan anymore." "That's ridiculous." Chao Yi was so exasperated that he started laughing. Then, he shot a glare at the woman in purple clothes behind Luoji. There was no emotion on the woman's face as she looked up at the sky and spaced out. It was as though this matter had nothing to do with her. It wasn't that she wanted to ignore Chao Yi or steer clear of this matter. It was her nature. Although Chao Yi and this woman in purple clothes were from the same clan, and they had known each other for a few years, they had rarely spoken to one another. That was because she always sported a dispassionate expression, and she'd rarely respond to anyone's questions. He had always felt that his junior sister was a peculiar person. In fact, she wasn't indifferent. It was just that nothing in this world seemed able to pique her interest. Therefore, he didn't believe Luoji when the latter said that she had agreed to leave with him. Why would such a woman agree to anyone's request on a whim? Upon retracting his gaze, Chao Yi sported a cold expression and uttered, "Luoji, I've been putting up with you because you're a disciple from Infinite Island, but it doesn't mean you can keep making a scene." After a sigh, Luoji refuted, "Why don't you get it?" All of a sudden, he took a big step forward as his face almost came into contact with that of Chao Yi. Then he looked deep into his eyes. "I'm bringing Z away now. Do you dare to disagree?" A furious Chao Yi thought that this guy was trying to oppress him. Although Luoji was only a second-order cultivator, he was backed by Infinite Island. Therefore, if he wanted to bring Lan Ziyi with him, Chao Yi wasn't able to stop him. It wasn't like Chao Yi could beat him up. If he really did that, those from Infinite Island wouldn't let him off. Certainly, he could capture Ziyi, but Luoji wouldn't stand back and do nothing. All of them would be embarrassed if the tension escalated. At the thought of this, Chao Yi bellowed, "You can leave, but Z must stay. If you insist on taking her away, you'll only leave with a cripple." As he spoke, he lifted his right hand where a battlefield imprint that radiated a red glow appeared. In an impassive manner, he stared at Luoji and uttered, "Don't you forget that I'm the deputy leader that's in charge of this station. If she dares to betray us, I can request the heavens to destroy her cultivation." An unfazed Luoji retorted, "You can try." "Don't force me," Chao Yi said through clenched teeth. "Get lost." Luoji pressed his hand against Chao Yi's shoulder in an attempt to push him away. However, he was just a second-order spell cultivator, so how was he able to move a sixth-order body-tempering cultivator like Chao Yi one bit? No matter how much force he exerted with his hand, the other person remained unmoving. Then he quit doing that as he circled around Chao Yi with Lan Ziyi and shuffled towards the main hall at the front. "Ziyi, it's still not too late to repent." Ken Yi turned around, and as he watched his junior sister that was following Luoji closely, he decided to give her one last chance. However, she was still looking up at the sky and ignoring him. Nevertheless, he knew that she had heard him. After a sigh, he yelled, "Lanzi from 9-Star Clan ignores our rules, lusts after wealth, and intends to betray our clan. I, Chao Yi, request the heavens to destroy her cultivation." After he finished speaking, he looked sorrowfully at his junior sister who never stopped in her tracks. Although she was a little dispassionate, she was from the same clan after all. If it weren't because they were in a critical situation, he wouldn't have taken such a drastic measure. However, those from Mystic Sect were launching an attack on them, so he had to settle this issue quickly. Moreover, he had to let the others know the consequences of betraying the clan. Nevertheless, Luoji and Lan Ziyi continued moving forward as they soon entered the main hall. Chao Yi's expression changed as he realized something. Has she altered her imprint? It was a fact that Lan Ziyi had betrayed the clan, so supposedly, if the deputy leader requested the heavens to destroy her cultivation, it would certainly happen. However, nothing seemed to have happened to her, which was virtually impossible, unless she was no longer a disciple from 9-Star Clan, thus enabling her to break free from their restriction. Nevertheless, she could only quit the clan by modifying the battlefield imprint, but that would require a large amount of contribution, which the average Spirit Creek Realm Master couldn't afford. At that instant, Chao Yi suddenly figured out many things. It was no wonder that Luoji had suddenly come over to the station of 9-Star Clan to experience life. Given the fact that he was from a top great force like Infinite Island, he would be welcomed by everyone wherever he went. Now it seemed that he was well prepared. Since the beginning, his target had always been Lan Ziyi. However, why would he pay such a hefty price for her? In the past, Qiaoyi thought that Luoji lusted after her beauty, but now that didn't seem to be the case. There was no way someone like Luoji would be seduced by anyone's beauty. Wait a minute. Qiaoyi bellowed and directly leaped into the main hall, only to see that Luoji and Lan Ziyi had pressed their hands against the Divine Opportunity column. A glow radiated from the column and engulfed them. You can't leave just like this. Qiaoyi lifted his hand in an attempt to stop them. Luoji raised his chin at him. I suggest that all of you leave this place quickly. Otherwise, you'll end up in a terrible state. Huh. Qiaoyi was stunned. Boom. All of a sudden. The entire place shook as Qiaoyi almost fell to the ground. Turning his head, he saw a curvy figure hovering in the air outside the clan defending Grand Array. She was none other than the maidservant from Mystic Sect. At this moment, 9 big spiritual dragons in different colors had entangled with one another in front of the woman as they swirled around and turned into a violent force. Like a drill, they were clashing with the clan defending Grand Array. What's that? Given Qiaoyi's knowledge and experience, he still couldn't recognize what spell that was. However, he was certain that given her cultivation, it was impossible for her to cast such a spell. The power of her move was equivalent to that of a Cloud River Realm Master. It's the power of a talisman paper. It's a talisman paper that comes from the core circle. One has to spend tons of contribution to get such a talisman paper. How did she get it? Was it Wang Yang? But he hasn't been to the core circle, so how did he manage to get such a talisman paper? However, Qiaoyi didn't have the time to keep pondering this issue. That was because as the 9 dragons continuously pounded on the Grand Array, it started showing signs of falling apart. It wouldn't take a long time before the array would be broken. By then, all of them in the station would fall into danger. With a bitter smile, Qiaoyi staggered. It was no wonder that Luoji had decided to run away. He must have seen their enemies getting ready to activate the talisman paper. It would take a 6th-order spell cultivator a long time to get prepared in order to activate such a talisman paper. Luoji was from Infinite Island, so he was more knowledgeable than Qiaoyi when it came to spells. That was the reason he could recognize the talisman paper. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 92, Nowhere to Flee. The 9-star clan had completely lost the battle. The only person who could go against Wang Yang was Dong Shuyi, but he had left the station to hunt Mountain Tiger down. Once the Grand Array was broken, no one could stop Wang Yang from slaughtering them. Qiaoyi had a feeling that there was a secret plot going on, but he didn't have the time to ponder it. After activating his spiritual power, he yelled, "All of you, get ready to retreat." The disciples who had scattered everywhere to help defend the station were already apprehensive. Upon hearing what Qiaoyi had said, they immediately ran towards the main hall where there was a Divine Opportunity column. With the help of the column, they would be able to return to Zhou, which allowed them to escape from this calamity. Right then, a crack was heard coming from the clan defending Grand Array. A large area of fluorescent light spread around from the periphery of the station, as though the entire place had been lit up by fireflies. Xiao Zhu, who was hovering in the sky, lethargically fell to the ground. A well-prepared Wang Yang hurriedly caught her and held her in one arm. Then, he unsheathed his sword with his other hand and pointed at the front. "Kill them all." Oh! In the forest, Lu Yi was running for his life. His arms had been covered in blood, and his chest appeared burned. Someone like him was completely powerless to counter Dong Shuyi, who was a 7th-order cultivator. If it weren't because of his defensive spiritual patterns, he would have lost his life after his opponent used the first spell. Initially, he thought that he could increase his chance of survival by sneaking into this forest, but in fact, the densely grown trees were not able to help him conceal himself. Dong Shuyi relentlessly raced after him and continuously cast his spells, which easily felled the extremely large trees. Also, Lu Yi had been separated from Amber. When he was struck by Dong Shuyi's second attack, he was blasted off the tiger's back upon impact, which was how his chest was burned. He had no idea about Amber's condition, but the tiger must be severely injured. That was because when Amber tumbled, the ground was immediately dyed crimson. He didn't even have the time to check on Amber as he realized that there was no way he could survive. Therefore, he immediately decided to leave Amber. If they stayed together, Amber would also lose its life. Even if he was bound to perish, Amber could still survive at the very least. The feeling of a blade that had been pressed against his back became clearer. Fortunately, Dong Shuyi stopped gliding in the sky. That was because the trees around this place were tall and densely grown. If he continued gliding in the sky, he would lose Lu Yi quickly. Despite that, Lu Yi still couldn't get rid of a 7th-order cultivator like him. There was only 30% of his spiritual power left. He could only activate the spiritual pattern that could fend off Dong Shuyi's spell one more time. There's no chance for me. Lu Yi raised his blood-soaked right hand and clenched the hilt. Even though his life was short and not interesting enough, he still had to directly face his enemy before his death. All of a sudden, he heard a loud crashing sound of water. Initially, he didn't pay much attention to it, but when he realized what the source of the sound was, he hurriedly changed direction and rushed over to that place. When Dong Shuyi saw Lu Yi from a distance, he was so incensed that his gaze seemed able to spit fire. He had never expected that it had taken him such a long time to race after a 3rd-order cultivator, yet he hadn't managed to capture his target, which was unacceptable for him. Therefore, he became more determined to kill Lu Yi. Seeing as Lu Yi had changed direction, and upon hearing the crashing sound of water, he immediately figured out what Lu Yi was up to. "Brat, you can't run away from me. I'll spare you the pain if you obediently wait for death," Dong Shuyi bellowed. As his spiritual power swirled around him, he shot into the sky. While in mid-air, he saw a huge waterfall in front of him. Under the dazzling sunlight, the mist that was formed from the splash of water radiated the colors of the rainbow. At this moment, Lu Yi was seen leaping towards the bottom of the waterfall as he was engulfed in the rainbow light. "Where do you think you're going?" Dong Shuyi yelled and hurriedly cast a golden arc slash at Lu Yi. The golden arc slash that was cast by him, a 7th-order cultivator, was certainly more powerful than the one used by Luo Ji, a 2nd-order cultivator. The golden arc slash was about a meter long. The half-moon-shaped slash broke through the air and reached Lu Yi. However, due to the fact that both of them were moving rapidly, the slash slightly missed its target as it whizzed past Lu Yi's back. The spiritual power that was supposed to protect Lu Yi seemed to be made from paper as blood spurted out of his back. He felt so much pain that his face twitched. Just now, he didn't even have the time to activate a defensive spiritual pattern. If he was struck by the golden arc slash, he would have been cut into halves. As his figure fell swiftly, he plunged into the waterfall lake a moment later. He immediately dived deeper in an attempt to conceal himself. At the same time, Dong Shuyi also glided down the waterfall and hovered above the lake. Without hesitation, he hurled a golden arc slash at the spot where Lu Yi had plunged into the water. Compared to other spells, a golden arc slash was undoubtedly more penetrative. The water current would hinder the power of the slash, but there was no better way now, unless Dong Shuyi was willing to get into the water to look for Lu Yi. As soon as the slash came into contact with the water, the surface of the waterfall lake separated for a moment. Blood started dyeing the water red, and the shreds of some organs floated to the surface. Seeing that, Dong Shuyi hurriedly checked his battlefield imprint. Realizing that 10 points had been deducted from his contribution, he felt heartbroken. Spirit Creek Battlefield was a peculiar place. There seemed to be a mysterious force that controlled the contribution points of all cultivators. A cultivator who managed to kill an enemy in the higher order would be rewarded handsomely. However, if a cultivator killed a person that was 3 orders below them, a lot of contribution points would be deducted. The mysterious force seemed to be encouraging cultivators to challenge people in the higher order, while punishing those who oppressed the weaker cultivators. That was the reason powerful cultivators were rarely seen in the outer circle of the battlefield. Contribution was immensely useful for any cultivator. In order to earn more contribution points, one had to kill an opponent that was similarly powerful. A cultivator in the 6th or 7th order couldn't really get any benefits in the outer circle anymore. Even though they wouldn't completely leave the outer circle, they would try to get closer to the inner circle to receive some training. Dong Shuyi was a 7th-order cultivator, so he would only get some contribution by killing a 4th-order cultivator. If he killed a 3rd-order cultivator, 10 points would be deducted from his contribution. Likewise, if he killed a 2nd-order cultivator, 20 points would be deducted from his contribution. 10 points were not a lot, but it wasn't a small number either. To Dong Shuyi, he could only get 7 points by killing a person in the same order. If it weren't because those old guys from the sect had given the order, he wouldn't have come all the way here to kill Lu Yi. Fortunately, everything was over now. Then he took one more look at the battlefield imprint, because he realized that someone had sent him a message when he was checking his contribution points earlier. After he finished reading the message, his expression changed drastically. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 93 Saved. Initially, Dong Shuyi intended to look for Lu Ye's corpse, but the message in the battlefield imprint had made him feel flustered, so he wasn't in the mood to confirm that Lu Yi was truly dead. Just then, he received a brief message from Chao Yi again. "We're in danger. Come back quickly." When he saw Chao Ye's message earlier and realized that those cultivators from Mystic Sect were launching an attack on the station of 9-Star Clan, he wasn't anxious at all. That was because it wasn't easy to invade a station. According to his own estimation, even if those from Mystic Sect had gone all out, the grand array around his station could last for 1 to 2 days, which would buy him enough time to kill Lu Yi before going back. However, just a short time later, Chao Yi sent him such a message, which went to show that the situation in the station was truly terrible. Hurriedly, he headed back to the station, and at the same time he sent a message to Chao Yi in order to find out what was going on. Nevertheless, just like a stone plunging into the ocean, he couldn't get any reply. Under the waterfall lake, Lu Yi was in a groggy state as almost all his spiritual power had been depleted. Blood kept spurting out of his wounds, and some pieces of his flesh floated around. Upon plunging into the water, he realized that there was someone else in there. The person seemed to be collecting something under the water. As their eyes met, both of them were shocked. However, Lu Yi didn't have the time to explain anything to him. Upon stabilizing himself at the bottom of the lake, he immediately activated a spiritual pattern above his head. The next instant, a golden arc slash broke through the water and reached them. The cultivator didn't even groan in pain when he was cut to pieces, so it could be said that he had suffered from a disaster that was uncalled for. The spiritual pattern above Lu Ye's head also broke apart upon impact. Fortunately, the rest of the golden arc didn't reach him. The attack soon stopped, but he didn't dare to show up as he wasn't certain about what Dong Shuyi was doing. Enduring his exhaustion and pain, he kept moving forward under the water for several dozen breaths. It wasn't until he was about to suffocate that he hurriedly stuck his head out on the surface. After taking a deep breath, he quickly submerged into the water again and moved forward with difficulty. After doing this several times, he became extremely exhausted. Nevertheless, he felt fortunate that Dong Shuyi didn't launch an attack on him again. When he emerged on the surface again 15 minutes later, he felt a force striking him from behind as though something had hit him. His back was already injured and he was in a terrible state, which was why he almost passed out upon impact. Instinctively, he thought that Dong Shuyi had reached him, so he unsheathed the sword from his waist and turned around to slash back at him. However, there was no one in sight. All he saw was a wooden slab that had been cut into halves. It was this wooden slab that had struck him. Looking around, he realized that Dong Shuyi was nowhere to be found. Holding the sword in his hand, he felt perplexed. "Where's that guy? A 7th-order cultivator has come all the way here to hunt me down, and he pushed me over the edge. It's not likely that he'd give up at this point." Nevertheless, he couldn't find Dong Shuyi at all, so he could confirm that the older guy had really left. Soon a realization dawned upon him. When he was under the waterfall lake earlier, a cultivator was killed by Dong Shuyi. Could that guy think that he had killed me? It was highly possible. Moreover, those from Mystic Sect were raiding the station of 9-Star Clan, which was why Dong Shuyi wasn't in the mood to get into the water to make sure that Lu Yi was dead. After confirming that he had indeed killed a person, he hurriedly left the place. "Is that the reason I've gotten out of the woods?" Upon that realization, Lu Yi became at ease as his exhaustion and pain came over him, which caused his body to keep sinking. Hurriedly, he raised his hands and grabbed the wooden slab to make himself afloat with difficulty. He felt extremely dizzy, as if he might pass out at any moment. Nevertheless, he knew that if he became unconscious at this point, he would not be able to awaken again. This time he was seriously injured. With his right hand trembling, he fished out a jade bottle from his storage bag. After lifting the lid, he poured everything into his mouth regardless of how many healing pills there were. Upon chewing them, he gulped them down. He even intended to switch his cultivation technique to gluttonous feast to increase the speed at which the pills were absorbed. However, he didn't have much spiritual power left, as all his spiritual points were empty. His golden liberation technique was about to stop running, and he didn't have much energy left to use a different cultivation technique. Therefore, he could only do his best to tie his clothes to the wooden slab. Don't drown. That would be laughable. When the last thought sprang into his mind, his vision darkened as he lost his consciousness. When he opened his eyes again, he realized that he was lying on his stomach on a bed. After a momentary daze, an indescribable pain came over him. What surprised him was that there was a person seated beside him. A pleasant scent permeated the air. From the corner of his eye, he could see that it was a curvy figure, so he reckoned that the person next to him was a woman. Besides the pain, he also felt a numbing sensation on his back. Additionally, he could feel a slight fluctuation of spiritual power, and a green light kept flickering. Was he saved by someone? He recalled that, before he passed out, he had tied his clothes to the wooden slab. Therefore, he would supposedly flow with the water current afterwards. Now that he appeared in such a place, it was apparent that someone had saved him. He didn't utter a word, as he wasn't sure who his rescuer was. Secretly, he tried to check on himself. It was terrible, as he was still severely injured, and his spiritual power hadn't recovered. Besides a deep cut on his back, his chest and arms were all burned. These injuries were fatal for the average person, but he was a cultivator now, so he was able to persevere for a longer time. Moreover, he had gulped down some healing pills before he passed out, which should help keep him alive. Nevertheless, he was still in a horrible state. "Your breathing has changed," a pleasant and soft voice was suddenly heard saying. "It's expected that you're vigilant of a stranger, but if I wanted to kill you, you would have lost your life by now." An embarrassed Lu Yi remained silent, as he wasn't sure what to say. Just then, the woman extended her fair hand and said, "Although I've saved you, I still have to find out which side you're from." After she finished speaking, a light blue glow radiated from the back of her hand. She had taken the initiative to reveal the side she was from, which made Lu Yi to be at ease. After he activated his remaining spiritual power, a light blue glow also appeared on the back of his hand. "I've saved the right person," then she uttered gently. Despite her soft voice, Lu Yi was certain that if he wasn't willing to reveal the color of his battlefield imprint earlier, or that the glow on the back of his hand was red, she would certainly kill him. In Spirit Creek battlefield, coming from a different side was a valid reason to kill. There was no room for mercy and pity. The numbing sensation on his back intensified, and the green light flickered more frequently. A moment later, the fluctuation of spiritual power on his back stopped, and following that, the woman applied something on his wounds, which pained him and caused him to be covered in sweat. Then she pasted something on the wounds on his back. Lu Yi couldn't see it, but he reckoned that it was a plaster or something. After she was done with all that, she rose from the chair and said, "You're seriously injured, and you'd better stay put so that your wounds are not irritated." "Thanks," she replied. "It was Ling Yu who discovered you and brought you back." After she finished speaking, she shuffled out of the room. It wasn't until this moment that he saw the woman's profile. Perhaps it was because she had helped him, but he felt that this woman was as beautiful as a fairy. Her chest was especially plump. With her hands placed on her belly, she walked in an elegant manner. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 94, Kind-Hearted People. After staying awake for a moment, Lu Yi slowly dozed off again. When he awakened, he realized that there was a chair in front of him, on which a young woman was seated. With her head hung low, she kept dipping her head as though she was knackered. The pungent smell of blood permeated the room, and it was tinged with the scent of herbs. Although he had laid on his stomach for a long time, he didn't find it difficult to breathe at all. Even the burn on his chest didn't feel painful, which puzzled him. After scanning it, he realized that the part of the bed beneath his chest had been hollowed out. The person who had placed him here must be very considerate, as they had taken his injuries into consideration. With difficulty, he tried to move his body in an attempt to get up, but presently, he didn't have much energy. After several attempts, instead of getting up, he felt so much pain that his forehead was drenched in sweat. Hearing the noise, the young woman suddenly opened her eyes and stood up straight. "You're awake." She came close to the bed and helped him up. Despite her petite figure, she was still strong as a cultivator. However, since Lu Yi was injured both on his back and his chest, he could only sit up on the bed. Then the young woman picked up a bowl of green herbal juice from the side and said, "Sister Wuxia said that you have to drink this bowl of herbal juice when you wake up. This will help with your wounds." Lu Yi had no idea who Sister Wuxia was, but he reckoned that it must be the curvy woman he had seen earlier. After taking the bowl, he said thanks. When he got the bowl closer to him, a pungent smell came right at him. He frowned as the smell of this bowl of herbal juice was terrible. Nevertheless, it was said that medicine was always bitter, so he directly chugged it down. He wasn't worried that they would harm him. If they were ill-intentioned, they would have done it a long time ago, which spared them the trouble. The next moment, a myriad of expressions came over him. This thing wasn't only pungent, but it was also nauseating. He regarded himself as a man who could put up with nasty things, but as soon as the herbal juice came into his mouth, he almost passed out again, for it was extremely bitter. He even suspected that he was drinking some kind of bile. The young woman seemed to have expected this, so she stared fixedly at him and said anxiously, "Sister Wuxia said that you must drink it all. Otherwise she'll get mad. When that happens, we'll be doomed." Without waiting for her to speak any further, Lu Yi only paused for a moment before he finished the herbal juice. After taking the bowl, the young woman fished out a taupe-colored thing from her storage bag and passed it to him. "Have a taste." A curious Lu Yi took it and put it into his mouth before arching his brow. This thing tasted like maltose. It wasn't until this moment that he had the time to scan his surroundings. Presently, he was in a building made from bamboo. The room he was in couldn't be considered spacious, and the decorations were rather simple. He wondered where he was now. While he was looking around, the young woman cleaned things up as she said, "I'm Lingyu, senior brother. What's your name?" "Yi," Lu Yi replied. Then he immediately realized that he had heard of that name before. After giving it a thought, he finally recalled where he had heard the name from. "It was you who saved me." Earlier, the curvy woman told him that it was Lingyu who saved him. If he wasn't mistaken, Lingyu must be the young woman in front of him. "I brought you back, but it was Sister Wuxia who saved you." Lingyu smiled. "You were floating on the river, so I thought you were dead. Initially, I wanted to get some stuff from you, but after discovering that you're still alive, I decided to bring you back." Oh. The smile on her face made the corner of Lu Ye's mouth twitch. "Anyway, thanks for saving me. That was the least I could do. In fact, we were both saved by Sister Wuxia." Lingyu flashed a smile at him. Her face was rather fleshy and fair. There was a dimple on the left side of her face when she smiled, which made her look adorable. At this moment she was already done with cleaning things up. "Take a rest. Sister Wuxia has gone out, but she'll come back in the evening and check on you. If anything happens, just shout. My room is only beside yours." In response, Lu Yi nodded gently. After Lingyu left the room, she also closed the door. They're all kind-hearted people. Lu Yi felt that luck was indeed on his side. Anyway, the most important thing was that all of them were from the Grand Sky Coalition. If he came across those from Thousand Demon Ridge, his stuff would have been taken away from him. Regardless, he was grateful for what they had done for him. His sword was still around as it was also brought back and placed beside the bed. His storage bags were also neatly placed on the bedside table. Although they didn't know one another, they were truly virtuous for saving him and not taking his stuff. Even though he had survived, it would take him a long time to recuperate. After all, he was severely wounded by Dong Shuyi. The most important task for him now was to restore some spiritual power first. Whatever the case, a cultivator needed spiritual power to protect himself. With difficulty, he raised his hand and picked up one of his storage bags. Then he fished out a bottle of spirit-restoring pills and stuffed one pill into his mouth before refining it. After refining 2 pills, he was finally able to reactivate Gluttonous Feast, which would improve his recovery efficiency. Then he took out a healing pill and gulped it down. Following that, he started building gathering spirits around his spiritual points. All of this hard work got him covered in sweat. Soon the night descended upon them. Lu Yi was adjusting his breathing when he heard someone pushing the door open in the adjacent room. Following that, Ling Yu's melodious voice was heard saying, "Sister Wuxia, you're back." Yes, it was the same soft voice Lu Yi had heard some time ago. Then, the ladies started murmuring among themselves for a long time. Outside the bamboo room, the woman called Wuxia talked to Ling Yu for a bit before shifting her attention to Lu Ye's room. She could faintly feel that with his room as the center, the spiritual qi in the air was gathering together. Although it wasn't conspicuous, she could still see it when she was paying close attention. At that instant, she was surprised as this young man brought back by Ling Yu seemed to be highly talented. However, she wasn't aware that the reason Lu Yi was able to gather the world's spiritual qi was mainly due to gathering spirits. As for his talent, it was a sorrowful story. "Have some rest." Wuxia patted the young woman's head. A smiling Ling Yu asked, "Do you need my help?" "There's no need. I'll have a rest then." After they were done with the chat, Wuxia shuffled towards Lu Yi's room and knocked on the door before pushing it open. Lu Yi had stopped cultivating and even deactivated his gathering spirits. That was because he realized a problem in the past. Once he activated gathering spirits, the sign of world spiritual qi moving towards him was conspicuous. It was a normal sign when he was cultivating, but if others still saw that the spiritual qi was still flowing towards him when he wasn't cultivating, he would have a hard time explaining it. When he saw the woman entering the room, his eyes brightened. On the previous day, he had only seen her profile, but now they were directly facing one another. She was indeed a gorgeous lady. The white dress with blue stripes she was wearing perfectly outlined her hourglass body. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 95, Medicine Cultivator. "How do you feel?" Wuxia walked up to Lu Yi and stopped in her tracks. A soothing scent wafted from her body. Lu Yi replied, "I feel much better now." "I'll have a look." Wuxia sat her fleshy backside on the bed and lifted his sleeves to examine the wounds on his arms. Following that, she unbuttoned his collar to take a glance at his chest before nodding. "Not bad." Then, she fished out something from her storage bag and put it on the bedside table before saying, "Take off your top." Lu Ye's top was tattered and drenched in blood. Previously, he was too focused on healing his wounds, so he had forgotten to change into new clothes. Now, upon hearing what she had said, he obediently took off his top. As Wuxia got ready with the thing she had just taken out, she said, "Your arms and chest are severely burned, so I can't dress them up yet. I'll apply some herbs on them for the next few days." "All right," Lu Yi replied. "Stretch out your hands," Wuxia uttered. Lu Yi extended his hands, which revealed his arms that were covered in green herbal juice. It was supposed to have been applied to his arms on the previous day. At that time he was still unconscious. Then Wuxia used something to clean his arms before applying the same kind of green herbal juice again. After she was done with his arms, she went on to apply the juice on his chest. There was a cut on his back, which wasn't handled in the same way. Lu Yi recalled that she had pasted a plaster on his back on the previous day, which made him feel itchy all day. When it was time to handle the wound on his back, she told him to turn around and said, "Bear with it." Before Lu Yi could reply to her, he heard a tearing sound coming from his back. She must have peeled off the plaster from the previous day. Instantly, he felt a sharp pain in his wound, which caused him to tremble and become drenched in cold sweat. This woman called Wuxia was always soft in her tone, but she was ruthless whenever she made a move. A green light started flickering again as a fluctuation of spiritual power was felt. An astonished Lu Yi turned his head and faintly saw something. Upon realizing something, he asked, "Senior sister, Are you a medicine cultivator? Previously, Pang Dehai from Righteous Sect had told him that cultivators were categorized into 6 major factions: body-tempering cultivators who focused on training their bodies, combat cultivators who focused on close-quarters combat, spell cultivators who studied all kinds of spells, medicine cultivators who healed the wounded, ghost cultivators who could communicate with the supernatural beings, and external cultivators who studied making pills, drawing talisman papers, setting up arrays, and forging artifacts. Most cultivators were weak in the beginning, so they would focus on combat cultivation. With a weapon in their hand, they could better protect themselves when they were still weak. It was also easier for them to walk around Spirit Creek battlefield. However, during this period of time, cultivators could make some preparation according to their own attributes and preferences. When they became powerful enough, they could choose a faction to focus on. The cultivators Lu Yi had seen in Split Sky Gorge were mostly combat cultivators. Only Luo Ji had established himself as a spell cultivator when he was only in the second order. That was because he was from a top great force, so he had the kind of heritage and wealth most people lacked. Dong Shuyi was also a spell cultivator, but he was already in the 7th order. Now, Lu Yi had come across another cultivator who had confirmed her faction, and she was a medicine cultivator. It was no wonder that she could heal him. Yes, Hua Xiai replied. What's wrong? Do you hate medicine cultivators? Lu Yi hurriedly said, no. I only have grudges against some spell cultivators. He secretly swore that whenever he bumped into a spell cultivator that he hated in the future, he would kill the person first. With her mouth covered, Hua Xiai giggled. I can see that. Lu Ye's wounds were obviously caused by powerful spells. As a medicine cultivator whose job was to heal the injured, she could make a judgment by just looking at the wounds. As she directed more spiritual power into his body, Lu Yi could feel that the pain on his back diminished. Eventually, his wounds only became itchy. After she stopped, she pasted a new plaster on his back. Following that, she started dealing with the wounds on his chest and arms. It was then Lu Yi could clearly see that as her hands hovered above his wounds, her palms radiated a green glow. With the nourishment of her wood attribute, his wounds slowly healed. This was indeed an amazing way to treat a patient. She was an alluring lady with a curvy figure and a pleasant voice. Certainly, Lu Yi didn't feel bored during the treatment. A moment later, she stopped what she was doing and rose from the bed. All right. Today's session is over. Then she extended her hand. 10 spirit stones, please. A puzzled Lu Yi looked up at her. Huh. A smiling Hua Xiai said, every treatment costs 5 stones. You were knackered yesterday, so I didn't tell you about it. Including the fee today, it's 10 stones in total. You charge a fee? Lu Yi was stunned. She went on to say, I have to buy you the herbs, and I need pills and stones to restore my spiritual power, so I do charge a fee. At that, Lu Yi was rendered speechless. You're a disciple from a top great force, so I believe that you won't renege on your debt, right? Her hand obstinately and firmly remained stretched out. Of course I won't. Lu Yi had no idea how she had figured out that he was a disciple from a top great force, but she had a valid point. They were not friends or relatives. Since she had spent time and energy treating him, he certainly had to pay a fee. Coming across a medicine cultivator here had undoubtedly saved him a lot of time of recuperation. Taking that into consideration, he had actually gained some benefits. I don't have spirit stones. Do you take spirit pills? Lu Yi asked. Sure. Hua Xiai nodded. Then he fished out a bottle of 10 pills and passed it to her. Thanks. Upon taking the pills, Hua Xiai became elated. Lu Yi was so worried that she would say something like, please come again the next moment. Take a rest then, she uttered. I'll come back tomorrow to treat your wounds again. Before she pushed the door open, she turned her head and said, if you can make use of healing pills, you'll recover more quickly. Got it. Lu Yi dipped his head. For the next few days, Lu Yi remained bedridden. In the morning, the young woman called Ling Yu would send him the extremely bitter herbal juice. In the evening, Hua Xiai would come over to heal his wounds. The young woman's full name was Ruan Ling Yu. She was a pretty vivacious and talkative girl. After some chats with her, Lu Yi learned that this place was the ruins of a great force. No one knew which great force it was. Several dozen years ago, this place was invaded and the entire great force was destroyed. Although a divine opportunity column remained, it was no longer usable. This made Lu Yi recall the time when the sect master sent him to Spirit Creek battlefield from the middle of nowhere. That place seemed to be the ruins of a great force as well. There were countless such ruins in both Jojo and Spirit Creek battlefield. Whenever a new great force emerged, they would pick one of the ruins to be their base. That was because there was most likely a divine opportunity column. However, many ruins remained deserted, which then became the gathering places for rogue cultivators. Although most of the buildings in these ruins were dilapidated, there were still many places that could fend off the rain. Moreover, most of them were strategically located, which was why homeless rogue cultivators loved staying in these places. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 96. Rogue Wanderers Club. Rogue cultivators didn't have a base, nor did they have the protection of seniors like those in a great force. After they entered Spirit Creek battlefield, the road ahead of them was paved with danger. Therefore, many rogue cultivators would come together and form into small groups. Those new great forces in Jojo were mostly developed from these small groups. With Wuxia, a medicine cultivator, as the core member, over 10 rogue cultivators had gathered in this place and formed a small group called Rogue Wanderers Club. Ruan Lingyu was an inexperienced girl, so after Lu Yi asked her some questions, he soon figured out the powers of the rogue cultivators in this place. Certainly, Wuxia was the most powerful among them as she was in the 5th order. Below her, there were 2 4th-order cultivators. The rest of the members were all 2nd or 3rd-order cultivators. There were 11 people in total. Due to the fact that Lu Yi had been recuperating in his room, apart from Wuxia and Ruan Lingyu, he had only seen another 4th-order cultivator. There were countless such small groups in Spirit Creek battlefield, and they were certainly not comparable to those real great forces. Lu Yi had taken part in the war between Mystic Sect and 9-Star Clan. Although they were 8th rank and 9th rank great forces respectively, they could easily deploy over 1,000 people. Even if all of them in Rogue Wanderers Club joined the war, no one would have noticed them. After a few days, Lu Yi had finally restored all his spiritual power, and he had even started cultivating. He was a 3rd-order cultivator whose 30 spiritual points were all full. Normally, if he wanted to unlock one more point, he would need 15 spirit-restoring pills. However, with the help of gathering spirits, he needed fewer pills. When he left Split Sky Gorge, he had about 350 pills in his possession. Initially, he believed that they were more than enough for him to ascend to the 4th order, but now, it seemed that his pills were not sufficient. That was mainly because he had to pay Wuxia 5 pills every day as treatment fee. It would take him 1 month to fully recover. That was thanks to her meticulous care. If she wasn't around to heal his wounds, it would take him longer to recuperate. During this period of time, he had used the 10-point map to ascertain his location, and realized that he was about 100 kilometers away from the waterfall. In other words, he had drifted such a long distance after he became unconscious. Previously, E and Amber were separated from him, so he intended to look for them soon. At that time Amber was injured, but he didn't even have the time to check on the tiger. Fortunately, he was Dong Shuye's only target, so the tiger was ignored. As long as Amber wasn't dead, and with E to keep it company, it should be all right. Now, his plan was to recuperate and then look for Amber. Under the night sky, Lu Yi was bare-chested when he wielded a sword in front of the bamboo room. Due to his injuries, he had stopped practicing sword-wielding for a few days. Now that he felt much better, he couldn't sit still anymore. With her palms supporting her chin, Ruan Lingyu looked out the window and observed him in silence. She didn't understand why he found it fun to wield a sword. He was injured, so shouldn't he be lying on a bed instead of exerting himself out here? However, she wasn't in any position to stop him, so she could only let him be. All of a sudden, her gaze brightened as she waved her hand. Sister Wuxia. Wuxia emerged from a nearby spot, and she was followed by a muscular man. That man was the 4th-order cultivator Lu Yi had met some time ago. His name was Kong Niu. According to Ruan Lingyu, the reason Wuxia always left the place early in the morning and came back late was that she had to go to the neighboring towns to treat the injured rogue cultivators to earn some cultivation resources. The battles between rogue cultivators were intense, so they would get injured most of the time. If their wounds were not severe, they could just take some healing pills. If their wounds were serious, they had to seek help from a medicine cultivator. Otherwise, they would be left with some hidden health concerns. However, they didn't have a great force to rely on, so their only option was to look for a medicine cultivator who was also a rogue cultivator. In that case, Wuxia wouldn't have to worry about having no business. Perhaps that was the biggest upside of being a medicine cultivator. They didn't have to take part in any battle in order to earn enough cultivation resources. Under the night sky, Wuxia shuffled towards a spot that was a short distance away from Lu Yi. Then she turned around and told Kong Niu to take a rest. In this small group of rogue cultivators, Wuxia was undoubtedly treasured and respected by everyone. No one would disobey her orders. Ruan Lingyu wasn't lying when she told Lu Yi that all of them were saved by Wuxia. That was indeed what had happened. Everyone in this small group had received treatment from her before. She single-handedly pulled them back from the death's door. These people owed her a favor. After they became healthy again, they chose to stay in this place because they admired her temperament or for some other reasons. Lu Yi stored his sword as he was already covered in sweat. Although some blood had streamed out of his wounds, he felt more energetic after some exercise. Furthermore, perhaps it was because he had escaped from death's door once, he felt that his sword-wielding technique had improved significantly. Nevertheless, he had to practice sword-wielding with someone else to be certain about it. Heisuke, I thought I could earn more pills. Why did he recover so quickly? Wuxia was heard muttering under her breath. Lu Ye's eyelids twitched. What did you say? After a few days of contact, they had become familiar with one another, and he had finally realized this beautiful woman's true colors. She was practically a miser. Every single day, right after she was done with treating his wounds, she would immediately demand payment from him as though she was worried that he would renege on his debt. On the previous day, she had sold him an even more bitter herbal juice. After drinking it, he felt as though his face had turned green. Moreover, he was unable to suppress the bitterness he felt in his body. Then she introduced to him another kind of herbal juice and claimed that it could soothe his discomfort. These 2 bowls of herbal juice cost him 4 spirit pills. At that time he even suspected that this woman was lying to him. Nevertheless, judging from how he felt on this day, she didn't lie to him. The bowls of herbal juice he consumed on the previous day were indeed more effective than the previous ones. Wuxia flashed a uniquely charming smile at him. Her voice remained soft and soothing, but she still had no qualms about saying words that were different from what she thought. I said that you've recovered quickly. Lu Yi pointed at his ear to mean that he wasn't deaf. Ignoring his gesture, Wuxia placed her hands on her belly, her posture remaining as elegant as ever as she said, in that case, I'll formally start treating your wounds tonight. What do you mean by that? Lu Yi was stunned. Then the previous treatments. They were just the preparations prior to the formal treatments. Do you think your wounds can be healed so easily? Wuxia appeared solemn. Doctors are most concerned about their patients. Don't worry. I'll take good care of you and make sure that you won't be left with any hidden health concerns. Lu Yi appeared befuddled as there was an idea that sprang into his mind. Is this woman trying to con me again? Take a bath now. I'll get ready and look for you later. Humanity's Great Sage. Chapter 97, Formal Treatment. In the room, Lu Yi was bare-chested and seated on his bed. Wuxia was seated across from him as her jade-like hand whisked across his chest. Your wounds have healed quicker than I expected. What's wrong? Are you going to walk down the path of body-tempering cultivation? A puzzled Lu Yi asked, What do you mean? Your vitality is richer than most cultivators in the same order, which is why your wounds have healed so quickly. Since you've cultivated vitality in the beginning of your cultivation journey, don't you intend to focus on body tempering? No. Lu Yi shook his head. He wasn't interested in becoming a body tempering cultivator. If nothing unexpected happened, he would choose to become a combat cultivator as it felt good to wield a sword to hack at other people. As for what Wuxia had said, he reckoned that the reason his vitality was abundant was that he ate a lot every day. Since he started cultivating, His appetite had become astonishing. He began eating even more after he mastered gluttonous feast. With so much food getting into his stomach every day, his vitality was expected to be plentiful. Nevertheless, he had always refined vitality into qi, so there wasn't any change in his body weight. If he had only gained vitality, he would have become a burly man by now. That's great. There's nothing good about being a meaty barbarian. Just like what other cultivators say, those people enjoy the best resources, but they'll also get punched the hardest. Wuxia started giggling. Moreover, you're too thin to become a body-tempering cultivator. Meaty barbarians. It's what they call body-tempering cultivators. That's interesting. Lu Yi put on a hearty smile. What do others call medicine cultivators then? After giving it a thought, Wuxia replied, they normally call us fathers or mothers. Lu Yi frowned. Why is that? That's because it's said that a doctor is like a patient's parent. Haha. Wuxia was convulsing with laughter. Lu Ye's expression darkened as the image of a mild-tempered and knowledgeable woman he imagined her to be had fallen apart. It was then he realized that this woman's appearance was different from her nature. One would only discover her true colors after getting into close contact with her. You've been stroking my chest for a long time. Are you sure you're treating my wounds? Lu Yi couldn't help asking. Even though it felt nice to be touched, this couldn't go on forever. After all, he was a young and energetic man. No. Wuxia retracted her hand. I'd forgotten about it as I was talking to you. Presently, she was seated across from him as she stared at him with a solemn expression. We'll start now. You might feel some discomfort later. Bear with it and don't make any strange noises. The walls around here are not soundproof, so others might get us wrong. Lu Yi wasn't sure how to reply to her, nor did he have the time to do so. That was because right after Wuxia finished her words, she pointed her fingers at his chest as spiritual power undulated around the tips of her fingers. In an instant, Lu Yi grunted. The spot that was pointed at not only hurt, but there was also an indescribable feeling that almost caused him to yelp. Wuxia tried to suppress her laughter and repeatedly pointed at his chest. Lu Ye's face started twitching as he couldn't help but keep grunting. Cultivators fight against one another all the time, and they might get injured. Although there are many forms of treatments, they might be left with some hidden health concerns. Normally, these injuries are not conspicuous, but they're hidden deep in the organs. They're not fatal, but if they're accumulated over time, they might affect a cultivator's physique and spiritual points, which will hinder his cultivation in the future. Flesh wounds caused by weapons are easy to deal with. However, the injuries caused by spells can't be cleared with pills. You're hurt by a fire spell, so some fire poison has been left in your body. Once the fire poison penetrates your spiritual points, it'll be hard for you to unlock new ones. If possible, I suggest that you look for a medicine cultivator to help look after your health from time to time to make sure that there are no hidden health concerns with you. At this moment, Lu Yi was clenching his teeth as he was unable to respond to her regardless of what she said. He was worried that when he parted his lips, he might really make some strange noises. There was a reason for him to suspect that this woman was doing this intentionally. Otherwise, she could have told him about it after the treatment instead of doing it now. A moment later, Wuxia started patting him instead as her slender hands gently stroked the man's chest. Following her pats, her pure would attribute spiritual power continuously streamed into his chest. After getting through the most tortuous moment, he could finally be at ease. 1 hour later, Wuxia retracted her hands. Lu Yi looked down and realized that his chest was covered in blood. These were all burns on his chest, so it was hard to heal them. After she patted his chest, his scabs broke apart, and blood started streaming out of his wounds, which made his injuries look worse. Nevertheless, Lu Yi knew that it wasn't the case. His wounds might appear to be worse, but some other stuff had also flown out of his wounds together with blood. It was supposed to be the fire poison she had just mentioned. After taking a deep breath, he realized that he could breathe more easily, and his entire body felt energized. Then Wuxia came over and applied the same kind of green herbal juice on his chest before she activated her spiritual power to help him heal his wounds. Following that, she dressed up his chest. Next, she handled his arms in the same way. Lastly, she had to deal with the cut on his back. After she was done with all that, she was already drenched in sweat. After wiping the sweat off her forehead, she stood by the bed and stared bitterly at him. What a shame. I guess you'll recover in 10 days. Hey! Lu Yi looked up at her. With her mouth covered, she chuckled. Oh no. Why did I blurt out my thoughts? She paused for a moment. Anyway, you don't have to worry. You're my most important client now, so I'll treat you properly. Then she extended her hand. 10 spirit pills, please. Without protesting, Lu Yi passed her 10 pills. Although the fee was 2 times more expensive than what he usually paid, it was worth it. He could clearly feel that her methods were indeed useful for healing his wounds. According to his own initial estimation, he would need a month to recuperate. But now it would take him only over 10 days. Moreover, she had indeed put in lots of effort on this day. At this moment, she was covered in sweat, and her face had turned pale. Apparently, she had expended quite some energy. What a generous man. With so much wealth in your possession, you can do whatever you want. I'm envious of you. Wuxia mocked him. Lu Yi became startled for a moment before realizing that she had just mocked him for spending resources willfully. Give the pills back to me if you don't want them. He extended his hand in an attempt to grab his pills. In an agile manner, Wuxia dodged his hand and put on a faint smile. Take a rest. Then she calmly left the place. Close the door. Lu Yi yelled at her back. Getting no response from her, he furiously leaped off the bed and closed the door before returning to his bed. He secretly decided that once he recovered, he would immediately leave this place. Otherwise, he would spit blood in fury sooner or later because of her. Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 98, Tassel City. Life had been peaceful for Lu Yi as he focused on healing his wounds and cultivating. With the consumption of spirit pills and the help of gathering spirits, he could unlock a spiritual point much quicker than he thought. If he did it wholeheartedly, it would only take him 2 days to unlock a new one. This was indeed incredibly efficient. Moreover, an auxiliary cultivation technique like Gluttonous Feast was also immensely useful for him. Wuxia would still pay him a visit every night. Under her meticulous care, Lu Ye's injuries recovered quickly. Sometimes they would have a chat. Interestingly, he had learned some useful information through her. The station of 9-Star Clan that was 200 kilometers away had been destroyed by Mystic Sect. It was easy for information to be spread around among cultivators. With the battlefield imprint in possession, they could add each other as friends. As long as they were in the same space, they could easily share information. This piece of news caught the attention of many people mainly because of the 2 great forces. 9-Star Clan was of a higher rank. It wasn't easy to invade the station of a great force because every station was protected by a grand array. Without breaking the array first, the invaders couldn't storm into the station. Even if the array was broken, they might not even succeed because the cultivators in the station were not ornaments. The invasion of a station rarely happened in the outer circle as all great forces were of a low rank, and their cultivators were relatively weak. Telling these weak cultivators to shatter a grand array was unreasonable. The reason those from Mystic Sect succeeded was that they had used an immensely powerful talisman paper that was exclusively used for breaking an array. Hence, those from 9-Star Clan suffered immeasurable losses. Many of their disciples were killed, and all the treasures in the station were taken away. After those from Mystic Sect left, they even burned the station down. Upon learning the news, Lu Yi wasn't surprised. Since those from Mystic Sect had the guts to make a move, they must have the confidence to achieve their goal. That he was gleeful. His injuries were all caused by Dong Shuyi. Now that the station of 9-Star Clan was destroyed, he could also get the fury off his chest. It was a shame that he couldn't take part in it. However, judging from what Wuxia had said, invading a station was different from what he imagined. He thought that after those from Mystic Sect occupied the station, it would become their territory, but it wasn't the case. They had only killed the disciples of 9-Star Clan and snatched their resources. Then they burned the place down and left. It was just like how those from Grand Sky Coalition had done it after occupying Evil Moon Valley. After invading the valley, they didn't stay there for a long time as they left the place quickly. That was because the valley was considered a territory of Thousand Demon Ridge. If they stayed there for too long, they would be besieged by those from Thousand Demon Ridge. It was the same case on this battlefield. 9-Star Clan must have other allies. If those from Mystic Sect remained in the station, they would be attacked by other great forces. That was the reason they hurriedly fled the place after grabbing all the treasures. Wuxia said that those from Mystic Sect had gained some considerable benefits for invading 9-Star Clan station. Besides the resources, there were also more important benefits. She explained that when the next evaluation of great forces took place, Mystic Sect would certainly ascend to the 8th rank. On the other hand, 9-Star Clan would drop to the 9th rank. It was unlikely that Mystic Sect could reach a higher rank by just snatching some resources. It wasn't appropriate for Lu Yi to ask about it, so he could only listen to her. She seemed to believe that he was a disciple from a top great force. It wasn't certain how this misunderstanding came about. Perhaps it was because he had been generous with his pills. Nevertheless, if he was really a disciple from a top great force, it was impossible that he wasn't even aware of such common knowledge. Tassel City was one of the neighboring cities, which was just like the ones Lu Yi had visited. There wasn't a uniform architectural style, as the buildings were a mixture of different styles from Jiuzhou. The biggest building in this town was the branch of the Divine Trade Association. Lu Yi was a regular customer of this association. After tagging along Wuxia and the others to this town, he headed straight to this place. That was because he didn't have many pills left. After half a month of recuperation, he had given over 100 pills to Wuxia, which allowed this unconscientious woman to become wealthy. Additionally, he needed the pills to cultivate. Initially, he had over 300 pills, but half of them were gone now. Presently, he had unlocked up to 35th spiritual point, but his remaining pills were not enough to help him ascend to the 4th order. Certainly, he could rely on gathering spirits to slowly improve himself. Nevertheless, to him, gathering spirits was just an auxiliary method. He mainly cultivated through the consumption of spirit pills. It was like once a person was used to eating delicate food, he would lose interest in plain food. The interior design of this branch of the Divine Trade Association was about the same as the one he had visited previously. Following a maidservant, he stepped into a room and waited patiently. Just like what he had done in the past, he gulped down a few bottles of spirit tea. This time, it was a well-mannered male cultivator in his 30s who made a deal with him. Lu Yi decided to sell 4 yuan metal ores. After that, he only had 6 ores left. Then, he decided to deal with the storage bags he had obtained from the young master of 9-Star Clan and 3 of his subordinates. These 4 bags had been with him for quite some time. He didn't care about 3 of the bags as they probably didn't contain any good stuff. Therefore, he sold them all to the association and received 15 spirit stones. In the past, he had sold some storage bags which were basically worthless. That was because one had to bear the risk to unlock a bag. Most low-rank cultivators didn't have any treasures with them, so the buyer from the association would only offer 5 stones for 1 bag. Certainly, one could also choose to ask someone from the association to help lift the restriction of the bag. It depended on the person's luck whether he could obtain anything useful. If he was lucky, he would be rewarded handsomely. If he was unlucky, he would suffer a huge loss. As for the young master's bag, there was no way Lu Yi would sell it for a dirt cheap price. That guy must possess some good stuff. After he made such a request, those from the association directly agreed to it. They wouldn't care where their customers got the bags from. Their service could be purchased with a fee. In Spirit Creek Battlefield, the Divine Trade Association was a unique presence as it didn't belong to any side. The manager of the association brought Lu Yi to a secret room and introduced him to an old cultivator before leaving the place. The old cultivator was an expert in unlocking restraining locks as he was one of the best in his trade. There was a job title for these people in the cultivation world. They were called locksmiths. Lu Yi fished out the storage bag of the young master from 9-Star Clan. The old cultivator examined it for a moment and offered a price. After making the payment, Lu Yi waited patiently. 1 hour later, a glint flashed across the old cultivator's hands, whereupon he passed the bag back to him. "It's done." Without intending to take a look inside the bag, Lu Yi took it and then fished out the bell-shaped artifact before saying, "Sir, please help me unlock this as well." Humanity's Great Sage, Chapter 99. A doctor is like a patient's parent. The intense battle with Dong Shuyi previously made Lu Yi feel helpless. Faced with a high-rank cultivator, a low-rank cultivator could hardly survive. However, if he had a defensive artifact at that time, he wouldn't have fallen into such a battered state. A defensive spiritual pattern was wonderful, but it consumed a lot of spiritual power. This bell-shaped thing was undoubtedly a good defensive artifact, which was why he wanted to own it. Nevertheless, he tried to activate its power some time ago, but this thing wouldn't accept a foreign spiritual power. Whenever he tried to infuse his spiritual power into it, his force seemed to be repulsed by something. It was like trying to open a storage bag that didn't belong to him, which was why he figured that this thing must have been locked. He wouldn't dare to keep trying blindly because when he was in Green Cloud Mountain in the past, he attempted to open a storage bag. In the end, he triggered its restriction and caused the bag to be destroyed. It didn't matter that a low-rank cultivator's bag was ruined, but it would be a shame if such a thing happened to this bell. The old cultivator gave him a weird look and took the bell. After examining it, he passed it back to him. A puzzled Lu Yi gazed at him. Following that, the old cultivator picked up a teacup and took a sip before saying slowly, "Little friend, you're a rogue cultivator, right?" How did he figure it out? Lu Yi played along and replied, "Yes." The old cultivator nodded. "It's difficult to be a rogue cultivator. All right, seeing as you're so generous, I'll teach you something." He pointed at the bell in Lu Ye's hands. An artifact is different from a storage bag. Every layer of restriction in an artifact is immensely important, because it'll affect the artifact's quality. Hence, there normally isn't any restriction that will cause the artifact to self-destruct, as it will lower its power, especially if it's a low-grade artifact. Although this artifact isn't a middle-grade one, it's already at the top of low-grade. The restrictions inside the artifact are only defensive. Do you understand what I mean? Upon pondering over what the elderly man said, Lu Yi finally figured out something. "Sir, you mean there isn't a restraining lock in it?" The old cultivator chuckled. "A restraining lock is just a name. A restriction itself is an invisible lock. However, if some restrictions are not resolved in an ingenious manner, there might be some terrible consequences like shattering or self-detonating. However, most restrictions don't share this characteristic, like the ones in this bell. You just have to use your spiritual power to penetrate those restrictions and soften them before you can use the artifact with ease. The reason you're unable to use it now is that the artifact is left with the traces of its previous owner." Hearing that, Lu Yi was stunned as he had gotten it wrong from the beginning. After getting this bell, he only gave it a try and quit because he was worried that he would make the same mistake. Now, it seemed that he had actually given up too early. The artifact originally belonged to the young master of 9-Star Clan, and was nurtured using his spiritual power. Therefore, the restrictions inside it were left with his traces, which was why Lu Yi was unable to use it. However, if he could erase those traces and nurture them with his own spiritual power, he'd be able to own this artifact. If the restriction inside an artifact was like a lock, the cultivator's spiritual power was like a key. The young master of 9-Star Clan was dead, so the key was lost. Hence, Lu Yi had to make a new key for the artifact using his own spiritual power. That realization finally dawned upon him. "Thanks, sir." Lu Yi rose from the chair and saluted him. The old cultivator waved his hand and picked up his teacup again. After leaving Divine Trade Association, he took a peek inside the storage bag and found over 30 spirit restoring pills, over 20 spirit stones, some bottles of pills he couldn't recognize, and some other miscellaneous items like women's clothes. These clothes were on the skimpy side. The tailors must have been economical with the fabrics. Lu Yi sighed and thought that the young master was such a playboy. There were not many things inside the bag, but he hadn't suffered a loss at the very least. Now, he only had 350 restoring pills. Unfortunately, he was left with the last 6 yuan metal ores, which made him feel dejected. Initially, he thought that these ores were enough to help him ascend to the 9th order, but now it seemed that he was wrong. After walking along the chaotic streets, he arrived at one corner of the city. In an instant, a shriek was heard coming from a short distance. Upon a glance, Lu Yi realized that a simple tent had been set up over there. There were several beds inside the tent. On one of the beds, The muscular Kong Nyo was pinning down a male cultivator who was trying his hardest to struggle out of his grip. A scarf had been wrapped around Hua Xi's head. Presently, she was rapidly slapping the man's belly, and following every slap, the man would screech. From time to time, blood would spurt out from the man's wound. His blood was of a dark color rather than red. It seemed that he had been poisoned. This place was a fixed spot where Hua Xi would treat her patients in Tassel City. Many severely injured cultivators from Grand Sky Coalition would seek her treatments. Business seemed to be terrific for her on this day, as there were several wounded people lying on the beds, awaiting her help. All of them appeared completely battered, which made one wonder what had happened to them. Every time the male cultivator shrieked, he would also call out, "Oh, mother!" There was no doubt that Hua Xi was an excellent doctor, but undeniably, her way of treating her patients was brutal. Lu Yi could once again confirm that she was the kind of woman who said the softest words but made the most ruthless moves. Hearing the man's cry, Lu Yi couldn't help recalling the joke regarding medicine cultivators that Hua Xi had told him. It seemed that she wasn't lying. Some people would really call her mother. "I told you to stop moving. Stop." Kong Nyo forcefully pinned the man down on the bed to make sure he couldn't escape. Tears and snot streamed down on the man's face as he exclaimed, "Kill me! Kill me!" His wail horrified the onlookers. Anyone who had no idea what was going on would have thought that he was being tortured inhumanely upon hearing that. A moment later, Hua Xi retracted her hands and caught a glimpse of Lu Yi, who was watching a good show on the side. Then she directly said, "Hey you, come over and help." Lu Yi pointed at himself. "Yes, you." Hua Xi picked up a piece of cotton cloth and cleaned the blood on her hands. A helpless Lu Yi walked over. Then she picked up a bowl of green herbal juice and pointed at the man. "Feed him." After Lu Yi took the bowl, terrible memories from the past sprang into his mind. With his lips curving into a smile, he shuffled towards the man who was to be fed with this bowl of herbal juice. Presently, Kong Nyo was still pressing the man against the bed. When the man saw Lu Yi approaching him, he had a premonition all of a sudden, so he struggled even harder. "Release me! Release me!" Lu Yi walked over and stood in front of the man before flashing a benevolent smile at him. "Hey man, it's time to take your medicine." "I don't want it." The man felt terribly alarmed as he shook his head violently. Lu Yi gave Kong Nyo a hint with his gaze, upon which the latter clenched the man's chin. Following that, Lu Yi directly poured the juice into his mouth. Gulp. Don't. Gulp. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.